There is a place in the northwestern corner of Australia where the land itself seems to breathe, where ancient red rock formations rise out of the earth like the bones of something that died before human memory began, where rivers run backward during the wet season, flooding plains so vast that from above, the entire region looks submerged beneath a shallow inland sea. The Kimberley, a wilderness so remote that even today, vast stretches of it have never been properly surveyed. A land so old that geologists have found rock formations here that predate the emergence of complex life on Earth by more than 1 billion years. And for at least 50,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples of this region, the Wunambal, the Ngarinian, the Warara, and dozens of other language groups, have been telling stories about what lies beneath it. Not beneath the soil, beneath the water, beneath the rock, beneath the oldest geological formations on the continent. They called it by different names in different dialects, but the warnings were consistent. Something was down there. Something that did not belong to ordinary time. Something that the land itself was keeping secret, and for good reason. For decades, scientists mostly ignored these stories. They catalogued them as mythology, filed them under folklore, smiled politely at the elders who tried to explain that their Dreamtime narratives were not metaphor, that when they said the water beneath the Kimberley was connected to other waters thousands of kilometers away, they did not mean spiritually, they meant literally. That when they described ancient creatures and formations beneath certain sacred sites, they were describing things they had always known existed, things they had been told to warn their children about, and their children's children, in an unbroken chain of transmission stretching back further than any written history on Earth. Then the scientists looked, and what they found changed everything they thought they understood about this continent, about underground hydrology, about the age of human knowledge, and about what it means when a culture insists for 50,000 years that something real and extraordinary is hidden beneath their feet. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe, and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it. The Kimberley region covers roughly 420,000 square kilometers of Western Australia. To put that in perspective, it is larger than the entire state of California. It is larger than Germany. It contains some of the most spectacular and geologically bizarre landscape on Earth, including the Bungle Bungle Range, those extraordinary orange and black striped beehive domes that look like they were designed by an alien architect with a preference for perfect geometry. The Mitchell Plateau, where ancient sandstone has been carved by millions of years of monsoon rains into a labyrinth of gorges so deep and so remote that some of them have never been entered by anyone outside the Aboriginal communities who have lived here since, before the Ice Age ended. And then there are the rivers, the Fitzroy, the Ord, the Drysdale, the King Edward, rivers that in the dry season shrink to trickles between ancient rock pools, and in the wet season transform into raging inland seas that cut off entire communities for months at a time. The people who lived here did not just survive this environment, they mastered it. They understood it at a level of precision that modern hydrology is only now beginning to appreciate. But the story of what is beneath the Kimberley begins not with the people who live above it, but with the water that flows beneath it. And that water has been flowing for a very, very long time. Deep beneath the Kimberley, running through fractured limestone and ancient rock formations, there is a network of aquifer systems so vast and so complex that hydrogeologists are still mapping its full extent. The Canning Basin alone, which underlies much of the southern Kimberley, is one of the largest sedimentary basins in the world, covering an area of approximately 530,000 square kilometers. It contains water that fell as rain thousands of years ago, water that has been filtering down through layers of rock for millennia, accumulating in vast underground reservoirs that are, in geological terms, almost unimaginably ancient. But it is not just the volume of water that makes this system remarkable. It is the way the water moves, or rather, in many cases, the way it does not move. Some of the water in the deepest aquifer systems beneath the Kimberley is what hydrologists call fossil water, water so old that it has not been connected to the surface hydrological cycle for thousands of years. In certain locations, the water being pulled from depth has been dated using isotope analysis to ages of 10,000, 20,000, even 40,000 years. This is water that fell on an Australia that looked nothing like the Australia of today. An Australia where the coastline was hundreds of kilometers further out to sea than it is now. An Australia where the Kimberley itself may have been a very different kind of landscape, one where the connection between the underground water systems and the world above was far more intimate than it is today. Aboriginal elders have spoken for generations about water dreaming, about sacred sites associated with underground water, about specific locations where the water beneath the ground rises close enough to the surface to influence the landscape above in ways that are invisible to the untrained eye, but completely legible to someone who has spent 50,000 years learning to read this country. When researchers from the National Centre for Groundwater Research and Training began a systematic mapping project in the Kimberley in the late 2000s and early 2010s, they brought with them the full weight of modern scientific equipment. Airborne electromagnetic surveys, deep bore drilling rigs, isotope analysis laboratories, satellite-based remote sensing technology. And when they compared their emerging map of the underground water system with the knowledge held by Aboriginal elders, something extraordinary happened. The elders knew. Not approximately, not in a vague, general sense. They knew specifically. They knew where the water ran deep and where it came close to the surface. They knew which rock formations acted as barriers between different aquifer systems. They knew which dry creek beds in the middle of the dry season would sustain plant life in a way that indicated subsurface water nearby. They knew which hills, which rock formations, which geographical features were associated with what they called water dreaming, and in almost every case, the scientific surveys confirmed that these locations corresponded to significant features in the underground water system. This was not a coincidence. This was knowledge, accumulated, tested, refined, and transmitted over thousands of years of intimate observation of this landscape. But the water was just the beginning. The Kimberley's geological story begins more than 3 billion years ago. The ancient Precambrian rocks that form the basement of this region are among the oldest exposed rock surfaces on Earth. They have been here, essentially unchanged, since a time when the planet's atmosphere was still being assembled, when the chemistry of the oceans was entirely different from today, when the kinds of life that would eventually evolve into everything we see around us had not yet appeared. These rocks record a history that is almost incomprehensible in its length. They have experienced supercontinent formations and fragmentations. They have been buried under kilometers of sediment and then re-exposed by erosion. They have been heated and compressed and fractured by forces operating over geological timescales that make the entire history of human civilization look like the blink of an eye. And within them, in fractures and voids and dissolved cavities that have been created and enlarged over billions of years, there are extraordinary things. The Kimberley is not, or at least not in the popular imagination, known as a cave country. That distinction usually goes to places like the Nullarbor Plain in southern Australia or the limestone karst country of the southeast. But that perception is wrong. The Kimberley is riddled with caves, hundreds of them, possibly thousands. Many of them have never been mapped, never been entered by anyone equipped with modern recording technology. Some of them are so remote that the only people who know about them are the Aboriginal custodians of those specific areas of country. And within those caves, there are things that have been sitting in the dark for an almost unimaginable length of time. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working in the Drysdale River area of the Kimberley, collaborating closely with Aboriginal traditional owners, entered a cave system that had been known to the local custodians for generations. The cave was not a secret, it was a known sacred site. What was remarkable was not that the researchers found it, but what they found inside it, and what the confirmation of what was inside told us about the knowledge systems of the people who had been caring for that site for 50 millennia. The cave contained art, not the relatively recent rock art that tourists sometimes see in accessible parts of the Kimberley, the ochre paintings of figures and animals that are visually striking but relatively recent in geological terms. This was something much older, much more mysterious, The art in question belonged to what researchers call the Gwion tradition, after the Aboriginal name for the mysterious figures that characterize it, though it is sometimes called Bradshaw art in older literature, named after a 19th century pastoralist who wrote about it, a naming that Aboriginal custodians have consistently rejected. Gwion figures are extraordinary. If you have never seen them, they are difficult to describe without sounding like you are making them up. They show humanoid figures in dynamic poses, wearing elaborate headdresses and decorations, carrying what appear to be bags or pouches, depicted in a style of artistic sophistication that was completely unlike anything produced anywhere in the world at the time. Researchers initially estimated they were created. They show figures that appear to be dancing, hunting, interacting with each other in complex social scenes. They show details of clothing and ornamentation that speak to a culture with a highly developed sense of aesthetics and a sophisticated material culture. For decades, the dating of Gwion art was one of the most contested questions in Australian archaeology. You cannot directly date rock art pigments with standard radiocarbon techniques if the pigment itself does not contain organic material. And the mineral-based ochres used in many of these paintings do not. Researchers had to be creative. One approach was to date the mud wasp nests that sometimes form over rock art, creating a kind of geological clock. The art must predate the nest. Using this method, and using luminescence dating of silica skins that form over the paintings, researchers have arrived at minimum ages for some Gwion art that push it back to between 17,000 and 20,000 years ago. Some estimates push it further still. But here is the thing that makes this archaeological conversation take on a different dimension when you bring Aboriginal knowledge into it. The Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley were never confused about when this art was made. They knew it was ancient. They knew it predated their own cultural memory. They had specific stories about who made it, stories that did not claim it was made by their own ancestors, but by beings who came before, beings who moved through this country in a time before the world was as it is now. And when researchers asked elders about the wasp nest dating, about the silica skin dating, about the minimum age estimates that science was producing, the elders were not surprised. They were not skeptical. They were patient. They had been saying this for as long as anyone could remember. But the art was not what the elders had most specifically warned about. What they had warned about, what they had insisted for generations, contained something that the modern world would eventually need to pay attention to, was what lay beneath the caves, what lay beneath the paintings, what the rock itself was sitting on top of. To understand what the scientists found when they finally looked, you need to understand something about the hydrology of limestone country, and particularly of what happens when ancient limestone is eaten away over millions of years by slightly acidic groundwater. This process, called karstification, creates the cave systems that cavers and spelunkers explore all over the world. But in the Kimberley, the process has been operating for so long, through geological periods so extended that the results are on a scale that is genuinely hard to comprehend. Beneath certain parts of the Kimberley, there are void spaces in the rock that are not cave rooms in the ordinary sense. They are not spaces you could walk into with a headlamp and a rope. They are fracture networks, dissolution channels, ancient conduits through the rock that connect different parts of the landscape in ways that have no surface expression whatsoever. The ground above these features can look completely solid and unremarkable, and yet beneath it, running through the rock, there are passages through which water has been moving for millions of years, carrying dissolved minerals, carrying ancient organic material, carrying, in some cases, gases that have been building up in geological terms over timescales that dwarf human civilization. When a series of boreholes drilled for water resource assessment in the late 2010s unexpectedly penetrated one of these deep fracture networks in a location I am going to call, for clarity, the Drysdale Corridor, the initial results were unusual enough that the drilling team stopped what they were doing and called in specialists. The water that came up was extraordinary in several respects. Its temperature was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but measurably wrong. Warmer than the ambient geothermal gradient would predict for water at that depth. Its chemistry was unusual, particularly in terms of its dissolved gas content. And its age, when subjected to isotope analysis, was shocking. The water was old, very old. The preliminary dates suggested it had been isolated from the surface environment for somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 years. You understand what that means. That water, the water that came up from that borehole in the Kimberley, had last seen sunlight before the first modern humans arrived on this continent. It had been sitting in the dark, in the rock, unmoving, since before the Aboriginal peoples of Australia began the journey of habitation and cultural development that would eventually produce the longest, continuously maintained knowledge tradition in human history. The elders were told about the borehole results, about the age of the water, about the unusual temperature and chemistry. And one of the senior custodians, a man whose family has maintained the dreaming stories of that particular area of country for as long as memory runs, said something that the researchers present described as remarkable. He said he was not surprised. He said the water that was down there was not the same water that was above. He said his grandmother's grandmother's grandmother had told her the same thing, that there was water beneath the country that had been there since before the world was made the way it is now, since before the sea was where the sea is, and that the water was not ordinary water, that it had sat in the dark so long that it had become something the country used to remember. Scientists, of course, do not publish papers using phrases like something the country used to remember, but when they analyzed the water more carefully, they found things that were, in their own language, remarkable. The dissolved organic content of the water contained chemical signatures that corresponded to conditions in the Kimberley's environment during the late Pleistocene, the period of the last ice age, when the climate of northern Australia was dramatically different from today. When the area that is now the Kimberley coastline was inland, a time when the sea level was over 100 meters lower than it is today, and what is now the shallow seabed of the continental shelf off the Kimberley coast was dry land. That dry land, now beneath the sea, was once home to Aboriginal people. We know this because we have found their tools on the seabed. Stone artifacts, grinding stones, the remnants of hearths, the detritus of human habitation sitting on an ancient land surface now covered by 60 to 100 meters of seawater. People lived there. They hunted there. They raised children there. And the stories of those people, the stories of what it was like to live in the Kimberley when the coast was somewhere out to sea and the land was different, those stories have been preserved. Not in writing, not in stone inscriptions, in memory. In the ongoing oral transmission of knowledge from elder to young person, generation after generation, for 50,000 years. The stories describe a time when the sea was far away, when you could walk from what is now the coast all the way out to where the islands are, and the islands were just hills, when the rivers ran differently, when the seasons worked in ways that were not quite the same as they are now. These stories have been analyzed by linguists, by geographers, by climate scientists, and the physical details in them correlate precisely with what we know about conditions in northern Australia during and after the last glacial maximum, the period roughly 20,000 years ago when global sea levels were at their lowest, and the coastline of Australia was dramatically different from today. Professor Patrick Nunn, of the University of the Sunshine Coast, has spent years collecting and analysing Aboriginal stories from across the Australian coast that appear to preserve memories of sea level rise. These are not vague stories about water, they are geographically specific. They describe particular features of the landscape that are now underwater. They describe how certain passages became impassable as the water rose. They describe the loss of land that people had known and lived on. And the geographical details in these stories match, with remarkable precision, what geologists know about the pattern of sea level rise along the Australian coast over the past 10 to 20,000 years. The implication is astonishing. It means that these stories, transmitted orally across generation after generation over a period of 10 to 15,000 years, preserved accurate geographical information about landscape features that now sit beneath the sea. It means that the elders telling these stories were not inventing poetic metaphors about distant floods. They were accurately recalling, through an unbroken chain of human memory, the actual physical appearance of a landscape that has not been visible to any living person for thousands of years. This is not mythology. This is oral history. And if oral history can preserve accurate geographical information about sea level rise over 10 to 15,000 years, what else has it preserved? This brings us back to the Kimberley and to the warnings, because the stories that Aboriginal elders have told about what lies beneath the Kimberley are not just about water, they are about connections, about the way the land beneath the surface links places that seem, on the surface, to be separate, about the way certain sites are related to each other in ways that go deep, literally deep, into the earth, about the existence of passages and routes and connections beneath the ground that the people above have always known about, even if they could not always explain them in terms that the scientific tradition would recognize. When the groundwater mapping project extended its work in the Kimberley, one of the things that began to emerge was evidence of connectivity between aquifer systems that, on the basis of surface geology alone, should not be connected. There were places where water from one geological formation was showing up in a formation that was apparently separated from it by impermeable rock layers. There were places where the response to rainfall in one part of the catchment was showing up as pressure changes in boreholes many kilometers away, in directions that made no sense given the surface drainage patterns. The elders had names for these connections. They had stories about them. They described, in the language of dreaming tracks and country, a network of underground relationships between different parts of the landscape that the scientific surveys were, slowly and painstakingly, beginning to confirm. The underground was not a featureless mass of rock and water. It was a network, a system, something that behaved, in some important ways, like a living thing, with parts that communicated with each other, that responded to each other, that were linked in ways that were not visible on the surface, but were absolutely real and absolutely consequential for understanding how the landscape worked. One of the most striking examples of this emerged from work done in collaboration with the Wunumbal Gambara people, whose country encompasses a large area of the northwestern Kimberley, including the Mitchell Plateau and the offshore Buccaneer Archipelago. For generations, Wunumbal Gambara elders had described a connection between specific inland sites and the sea, not a metaphorical connection, not a spiritual connection, though the spiritual dimension was also present. A literal, physical connection through which the country communicated between its inland and coastal expressions. When marine geologists and hydrologists began looking at the shallow submarine geology of the Buccaneer Archipelago, they found something extraordinary. The islands of the archipelago are not isolated geological features. They are the exposed tops of a geological system that extends far inland beneath the Kimberley Plateau. The same rock formations that appear on the Mitchell Plateau appear again in the islands of the archipelago, separated by water and by the coastal lowlands, but connected through the geology at depth. And the water that emerges in certain coastal springs that the Wunumbal Gambara have always known about and always maintained as significant sites, carries chemical signatures that indicate it has traveled from far inland, filtered through the rock of the plateau, and emerged at the coast through geological connections that operate far below the surface. The elders knew. They described this process in their own terms. They described the way certain inland sites and certain coastal sites were in relationship with each other, were the same country expressed in different places, were connected through what lies beneath in ways that made them, in some sense, the same place. And the science confirmed it. Not as metaphor, as hydrology, but there is another layer to the Kimberley story, one that takes us away from water and into something even more extraordinary. Something that the elders have been particularly insistent about in a way that has consistently puzzled and sometimes alarmed the scientists who have finally begun to look where they were directed. Beneath the Kimberley, and specifically beneath certain areas of the King Leopold Ranges, the Napier Range, and the extensive limestone formations of the Oscar Range, there are cave systems, real caves. Not the fracture networks and dissolution channels we discussed earlier, but actual void spaces large enough to enter, large enough to stand in, large enough in some cases to contain rivers and lakes. And within some of these cave systems, there are things that have not been exposed to the surface environment for a very long time. The Napier Range is particularly interesting. It is a fossil reef. That is not a metaphor or a geological term of art. It is literally an ancient coral reef, a structure built by organisms that lived in a warm, shallow sea roughly 360 million years ago, during the Devonian period. This was before the dinosaurs, before the first vertebrates walked on land, before flowering plants existed. The reef that became the Napier Range was built in a sea that no longer exists, by organisms that have no close living relatives. And when that sea disappeared, when the reef was buried and compressed and eventually exposed by erosion over hundreds of millions of years, it left behind a structure of extraordinary porosity. A rock mass riddled with holes, with passages, with caves and tunnels and void spaces that have been accumulating and changing for a longer period than the human mind can really encompass. In recent years, cave researchers working in collaboration with Aboriginal custodians have begun accessing parts of the Napier Range cave system that were previously unexplored, at least by anyone with modern recording technology. What they have found inside has been, in some cases, scientifically significant in ways that go well beyond the archaeological. First, there is the biology. Caves are, in biological terms, extraordinary environments. Cut off from sunlight, they develop their own ecosystems, fed by organic material that washes or filters in from above, inhabited by organisms that have adapted over long periods of isolation to conditions that would kill surface life. In the deepest, most isolated parts of cave systems, you can find species that are found nowhere else on Earth. Species that have been evolving in isolation for millions of years in the darkness, producing adaptations so extreme that when you first see them, they look almost alien. Blind fish, translucent invertebrates, fungi that grow in the absence of any photosynthetic energy source. And in some of the deepest and most isolated caves of the Napier Range, researchers have found things that are waiting for full biological description. Things that preliminary genetic analysis suggests have been isolated from the surface world for longer than the human species has existed. The elders, when told about the biology, were again not particularly surprised. They described the caves as having their own country, their own living things, their own laws. They said that the things that lived in the deep country, the below country, did not follow the same rules as the things that lived above. This is, from a biological perspective, completely accurate. Cave ecosystems are governed by different energy dynamics, different evolutionary pressures, different ecological relationships than surface ecosystems. The elders had described this in their own terms, accurately, for generations. But there is a second category of finding from the Napier Range caves that is more difficult to categorize, more difficult to explain, and more directly connected to the specific warnings that elders have historically given about what lies beneath the Kimberley. In several of the deeper chambers of the cave system, researchers have found sediment deposits. This is not unusual in caves, but the sediment in question is unusual in its composition and in its layering. It shows, in its stratigraphy, a record of what happened in and above these caves over an extended period. And within that record, there are anomalies. Layers where the sediment chemistry changes dramatically. Layers where the biological material preserved in the sediment shifts abruptly from one type to another. Layers that correspond, when dated, to periods of significant change in the surface environment above. One of these anomalous layers dates to approximately 12,000 years before present, a period that corresponds to the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising rapidly and the climate of northern Australia was undergoing a dramatic transformation. Another anomalous layer dates to approximately 45,000 to 50,000 years before present, a period that corresponds to the arrival of the first humans on the Australian continent. And a third, the deepest and most ambiguous of the anomalous layers, dates to a period much further back, a period that is still the subject of scientific debate. The significance of the layer corresponding to the arrival of humans in Australia is particularly striking. It shows, in the sediment record within these deep and apparently inaccessible caves, evidence of change that coincides precisely with the establishment of human habitation in the Kimberley. The specific chemical signatures involved suggest an increase in fire-related compounds, consistent with the practice of burning that Aboriginal people have employed as a land management tool since they first arrived. But the caves are not at the surface. The caves are underground. The fire-related compounds have worked their way down through the rock, through the soil, through the geological connections between the surface and the deep, to be preserved in the sediment of a cave that no one apparently entered. Or did they? Because in one of the deep chambers of one of the Napier Range caves, researchers found something else. On the wall of the chamber, in a location that would have required entering the cave and descending for some distance before reaching it, there are marks. Not the elaborate figurative art of the Guion tradition, not paintings of animals or people, simple marks, geometric marks. Lines and dots and curves arranged in patterns that, while simple in execution, are deliberate. They are not natural features of the rock. They are not the result of geological processes. Someone made them. When the researchers told the Aboriginal custodians about the marks, the custodians were not surprised. They said there were marks like that in deep places throughout the Kimberley, that the people had always gone deep, that the deep country was not separate from the above country, that the knowledge of what was below was as important as the knowledge of what was above, and that for the people who had held this country for 50,000 years, the idea that the underground and the surface were separate things that required separate kinds of knowing was a misunderstanding of how the country actually worked. The marks have not yet been dated. The dating of rock art, as we discussed earlier, is technically challenging and requires specific conditions, but their presence, deep in a cave system, suggests something about the relationship between the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley and the underground world that the scientific community is only beginning to fully appreciate. It has been assumed fairly consistently in the archaeological literature that cave art and rock art in Australia, even the oldest examples, was made in accessible locations, in rock shelters and overhangs that could be reached without specialized equipment. In caves with obvious entrances that anyone might walk into, the idea that people were regularly descending into deep cave systems, navigating underground passages, spending time in chambers far from the surface, is one that the mainstream of Australian archaeology has been slow to take seriously, partly because the evidence for it has been slow to emerge, and partly, it must be said, because the idea that a 50,000-year-old culture had sophisticated knowledge of and regular access to deep cave systems does not fit particularly well with the narrative of prehistoric life that most people carry in their heads. But the evidence is accumulating, and it is being confirmed, step by step, by the knowledge that Aboriginal custodians have been trying to share with researchers for as long as researchers have been willing to listen. The warnings about what lies beneath the Kimberley are not all benign. There are things that the elders have described as dangerous. Not in a vague, supernatural sense, but specifically dangerous. Places where the underground and the surface come close to each other in ways that the surface environment is not equipped to handle. Gases that emerge from deep fractures in quantities that can overwhelm an unprepared person. Unstable geological features that can shift without warning. Underground water systems that respond to heavy rain in ways that can flood cave systems with shocking speed. All of these warnings correspond to real geological hazards. The Kimberley is seismically active, not dramatically so, but enough that deep fracture systems can and do shift. It contains organic-rich geological formations in which biological activity produces gases, including methane and carbon dioxide, that can accumulate in low-lying areas or in cave systems with poor ventilation. And the cave systems of the karst country, particularly in the wet season, are subject to the kind of rapid flooding that has killed cavers in similar limestone environments around the world. The elders warned about these things, specifically, with detailed geographical information about which sites were dangerous and why. When researchers and cavers began exploring these systems, they found that the warnings were accurate. The dangerous sites were dangerous. The sites described as safe were, by and large, safe. The detailed geographical knowledge embedded in the warning stories corresponded to actual features of the landscape. But there is one category of warning that is more unusual. more difficult to explain in strictly geological terms, more connected to the deepest and most ancient layers of what the elders have been saying about the Kimberley for as long as anyone can remember. There are stories, found across multiple language groups and across wide areas of the Kimberley, about places in the underground country where the ordinary rules of the country do not apply. Places where the dreaming and the waking world are not properly separated. Places where what lies beneath is not just rock and water and cave and darkness, but something that is, in the Aboriginal understanding of the world, alive in a way that has no surface equivalent. These are not simple ghost stories. They are not warnings about places where bad things happened once and bad feelings linger. They are descriptions of specific geological or geographical features understood in a framework that integrates the physical and the metaphysical in a way that is not reducible to either without losing something essential. And some of the scientists who have spent significant time in the Kimberley working closely with Aboriginal custodians have begun to suggest, carefully, that the dismissal of this dimension of the knowledge as purely metaphorical or spiritual may have caused researchers to miss important information about the actual physical properties of these sites. There is a concept in geology and geophysics called geomagnetic anomaly, a place where the Earth's magnetic field differs measurably from its expected value, usually because of unusual concentrations of certain minerals in the rock beneath. The Kimberley is not particularly known for dramatic geomagnetic anomalies, but there are locations within it where the local magnetic field shows variations that are significant enough to be detectable with ordinary compass equipment. These locations correspond, with an interesting degree of consistency, to sites that Aboriginal custodians have historically described as places where ordinary orientation is unreliable. Places where you can become confused about direction, even in familiar country. This is not a mystical claim. This is a practical observation about a real physical phenomenon. If you are navigating by the stars, by the sun, by your sense of the Earth's magnetic field, as people have navigated for as long as humans have moved through unfamiliar country, then you will notice if the local magnetic field is behaving unexpectedly. You might not describe it in terms of geomagnetic anomaly. You might describe it in terms of a place where the country is doing something unusual, but you would notice, and you would remember, and you would tell your children. The observation would become a story. The story would become a warning. The warning would be transmitted, generation after generation, encoded in the dreaming knowledge of the people whose country includes these sites. And 50,000 years later, when a scientist with a magnetometer arrives at the site and measures the geomagnetic anomaly, the elder standing nearby will nod and say, "Yes, we knew about this. We have always known about this. We called it something different, but we knew." This is, in microcosm, the story of the Kimberley, of the gap between what has been known by the people who have lived here for 50,000 years and what has been discovered by the people who have been here for a few hundred years with the instruments and the institutions of Western science. It is a story about the multiple ways of knowing the world and about what happens when those ways of knowing are finally brought into genuine dialogue with each other. The dialogue has been slow to start. In the early decades of European settlement in the Kimberley, the relationship between Aboriginal people and the newcomers was marked by dispossession, violence, and a systematic disregard for Aboriginal knowledge that was not just ignorant but actively destructive. Aboriginal people were removed from their country, separated from the sites and the stories and the relationships with land that were the medium in which their knowledge was held. The missions and stations of the Kimberley, like those across Australia, were places where children were taken from their parents, where language was suppressed, where the transmission of traditional knowledge was interrupted in ways that caused irreparable harm to knowledge systems that had been maintained, intact, for longer than any other knowledge tradition on Earth. The recovery of that knowledge, where recovery is possible, has been one of the most important and painful processes in recent Australian history, and it is ongoing. There are elders in the Kimberley today who are the last speakers of their language, the last holders of specific bodies of knowledge about specific areas of country. When they die, certain things will be lost that no amount of scientific surveying or archaeological excavation will be able to fully recover. This is not a metaphor, it is a practical reality. The knowledge that is held in the minds of the elders is a primary source of information about this landscape that cannot be replicated by any other means, which makes the growing collaboration between Aboriginal knowledge holders and scientists not just intellectually interesting but genuinely urgent. The work being done in the Kimberley today, at the intersection of Western science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge, is some of the most exciting research happening anywhere in Australia. It involves groundwater science, archaeology, biology, climate science, linguistics, and geology, all operating in a framework that takes Aboriginal knowledge seriously as a source of empirical information about the world, not just as cultural heritage to be respected in a general sense, but as data, as evidence, as a body of knowledge about this specific landscape that has been accumulated, tested, and refined over 50,000 years of intimate observation. The results have been extraordinary, and we have not yet seen all of them. The mapping of the Kimberley's underground water system is still incomplete. The biological survey of the deep cave systems is still in its early stages. The archaeological work in collaboration with Aboriginal custodians is generating new findings every field season. And the process of listening to what the elders have been saying about this country and checking it against what the instruments find continues to produce moments of convergence that are, for the scientists involved, genuinely humbling. But let us go deeper, because the story of the Kimberley Underground is not just a story about water in caves and geological anomalies. It is also a story about time, and about what it means to have knowledge that is 50,000 years old. The oldest confirmed rock art in Australia, anywhere in Australia, is currently dated at about 65,000 years ago. This pushes the evidence of human symbolic activity here back further than the evidence in Europe, where the famous cave art of places like Lascaux and Altamira was long held up as the pinnacle of prehistoric artistic achievement. The Australian evidence does not get anything like the same attention in the popular literature, partly because much of it is in remote locations, and partly because the Western tradition has been somewhat slow to fully absorb the implications of what Australia's Aboriginal cultures represent. Because what they represent, among other things, is the oldest continuous culture in the world, and by a very significant margin, the Aboriginal cultures of Australia predate the construction of the Egyptian pyramids by tens of thousands of years. They predate Stonehenge by tens of thousands of years. They predate the beginning of writing, anywhere in the world, by tens of thousands of years. They were old when the ancestors of the people who built the first cities in Mesopotamia were still hunters and gatherers in the Middle East. This is difficult to absorb. Our mental framework for ancient history is constructed around the civilizations of the written record. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China. These feel ancient to us because our written history traces back to them. But they are, in the context of Aboriginal Australian history, recent. The knowledge traditions of the Kimberley were being maintained, the stories being told around fires, the dreaming tracks being walked for 40,000 years before the first pharaoh was born. What does it mean to have knowledge that old? What can survive accurately across that span of time? This is the question that is animating some of the most interesting scientific work being done in Australia today. And the answers that are emerging are changing what we thought we knew about the capacity of human memory and human culture to preserve information across deep time. The sea level stories we mentioned earlier are the clearest example. The ability to preserve accurate geographical information about coastlines that were submerged 10,000 years ago represents a form of cultural information storage that operates on a timescale that was, until recently, considered impossible. The scientific consensus was that oral traditions degraded too quickly to be reliable over more than a few hundred years. The Australian evidence suggests that this consensus was wrong, or at least that it was based on a sample of cultures that did not include the Aboriginal Australian tradition, which appears to have developed extraordinarily robust mechanisms for maintaining information fidelity across time. What are those mechanisms? Researchers are still working this out, but some elements are becoming clearer. The dreaming tradition does not just store information in stories. It stores it in multiple, redundant layers. A particular piece of knowledge about the landscape might be encoded in a story, in a song, in a ceremony, in a specific physical journey through the country, and in a set of visual representations in rock art or body decoration. If one form of transmission is interrupted or lost, the knowledge might survive in other forms. This redundancy is not accidental. It is, according to some researchers, a deliberately engineered property of the knowledge system, one that was developed precisely because the people who maintained it understood that knowledge needed to survive catastrophes, disruptions, the deaths of key knowledge holders, the dislocations of movement across country. The dreaming, in other words, is not just a spiritual framework, it is also a memory technology, a way of encoding and transmitting empirical knowledge about the world that was optimized over many thousands of years for durability, for surviving the things that would, in a written tradition, destroy the record. This reframing of what the dreaming is and does has significant implications for how we understand everything that the elders have been saying about the Kimberley Underground. When an elder says that a particular underground site has always been known to be dangerous, we are not just hearing a warning from one person's experience. We are hearing information that has been encoded, tested, and preserved across multiple millennia. Information that has survived the end of the Ice Age, the dramatic changes in climate and landscape that accompanied the rise of sea levels, the pressures and disruptions of the historical period. Information that has been checked by each generation of custodians against their own observation of the actual landscape and found to be accurate enough to be worth maintaining. The scientists working in the Kimberley today are the beneficiaries of this process. They are not discovering things about this landscape that were previously unknown to anyone. They are confirming things that were known deeply, specifically, and empirically by the people who have been here for 50,000 years. The scientific instruments are, in a real sense, catching up to the Aboriginal knowledge. This is not a comfortable narrative for a scientific tradition that has operated for several centuries on the assumption that empirical knowledge of the natural world is its exclusive domain. It is a narrative that requires humility. That requires the recognition that the instruments we carry, powerful as they are recent arrivals in a landscape that has been studied by other means for longer than any Western scientific institution has existed. The elders are patient about this. They have been waiting a long time for the scientific establishment to begin taking their knowledge seriously, and they are generous about sharing it, or at least generous about sharing the parts of it that can appropriately be shared with outsiders. Not all of the knowledge about the Kimberley Underground is public knowledge. There are things that are held by specific custodians for specific country, things that are transmitted in the appropriate ceremonial contexts, things that a researcher without the proper relationship to that country has no more right to demand than a stranger has the right to demand the private correspondence of a family they have never met. The negotiation of what can be shared, under what conditions, for what purposes, is itself an important part of the collaboration. It reflects an understanding, on both sides, that knowledge carries responsibilities, that knowing something about a place creates obligations toward that place, that the information encoded in the dreaming about the Kimberley Underground is not simply data to be extracted and published. It is living knowledge, held in a living relationship with a living landscape, and the terms on which it is shared need to reflect that. This is, incidentally, a lesson that Western science is now beginning to apply more broadly. The growing field of Indigenous knowledge systems research has produced a substantial body of evidence suggesting that traditional ecological knowledge, traditional environmental knowledge, the knowledge that Indigenous peoples around the world hold about the landscapes they have inhabited for long periods, is not merely culturally interesting. It is empirically valuable. It contains information about the environment that Western scientific surveys have not captured, partly because those surveys are too recent, too limited in time, to have observed the patterns and processes that an Indigenous knowledge tradition spanning thousands of years can encode. But the Kimberley is, in many ways, the most extreme example of this phenomenon, because the Kimberley knowledge tradition is the oldest, because the country it describes is one of the oldest geologically, and therefore one whose deep properties take the longest to reveal themselves to a science that has been operating here for only a few hundred years. And because the things that the elders have been saying about what lies beneath this country are, it turns out things that could not have been invented or guessed, things that required to know with any accuracy, the kind of sustained, multi-generational observation that only a continuous 50,000-year tradition could produce. We are going to turn now to something that lies at the edge of what the scientific establishment is comfortable discussing. But it is something that the elders have talked about, and that the geological evidence at least partially supports, and that the collaboration between Aboriginal knowledge holders and researchers has put squarely on the table in a way that can no longer be simply ignored. There are stories across the Kimberley, and in fact across much of northern Australia, about what the elders describe as the deep memory of the country, not the memory of the people, the memory of the land itself. The idea that the country, particularly the deep country, the underground country, holds information about what has happened above it, and that this information is not simply metaphorical or spiritual, but, in some sense, physically encoded in the geology. Geologists will tell you that this is, in a strictly literal sense, true. Rock is a recording medium. The mineral composition of a rock layer, the orientation of its crystals, the chemistry of its pore water, the traces of organic material preserved within it, all of these things encode information about the conditions under which the rock was formed and about everything that has happened to it since. Reading that information is what geologists spend their careers doing. The rock remembers, not in a conscious sense, but in a physical sense that is, at the level of information, quite real. What the elders are describing, when they talk about the deep memory of the country, may be pointing to something related. They are describing a landscape in which the connections between the surface and the deep, between the geological record and the living environment above, are not just structural features of the earth, but meaningful channels through which the past and the present communicate, through which what happened a long time ago continues to influence what happens now. This is not a scientific statement. It is a cosmological one. But it is a cosmological framework that, when it generates specific empirical claims about the physical world, has an extraordinary track record of accuracy. The deep fracture systems of the Kimberley do connect the surface to the deep in ways that allow material and information to travel between them. The geomagnetic anomalies of certain sites do affect the immediate environment in ways that are detectable. The underground water carries chemical signatures of past climates and past events in ways that are, quite literally, a physical record of history. The sediment layers in the caves do contain encoded information about what has happened above them across geological time. The elders' description of the deep country as a place that holds memory is, in geological terms, accurate. It is accurate in ways that a 50,000-year-old knowledge tradition would have had access to only through sustained, careful, transgenerational observation of how the landscape behaved. And it is being confirmed, piece by piece, by the scientific surveys that are finally, after centuries of operating in this landscape without looking where they were directed, beginning to look where the elders have always pointed. Now we need to talk about something that has received relatively little attention in the literature on the Kimberley underground, but that has been a consistent element of the Aboriginal warnings about this place. We need to talk about what the elders describe as the connection between the Kimberley and what lies far, far beneath. Not the aquifers, not the cave systems, not the fossil reef or the ancient crystalline basement, something much deeper. Something that the geological record of the Kimberley is only beginning to hint at. The Kimberley Craton, the ancient stable block of Precambrian rock that forms the core of the Kimberley, is a piece of the original Australian continent that has been essentially unaltered for over 1 billion years. Beneath it, at depths that human boreholes have never reached, lies material that was part of the Earth's mantle during the Archean Eon, a period more than 2.5 billion years ago when the planet was young and the geological processes operating at the surface were dramatically different from anything happening today. The Kimberley sits on some of the thickest and oldest continental lithosphere on Earth. The root of the craton, the deep keel of ancient rock that extends down into the mantle beneath it, is estimated to reach depths of 200 kilometers or more. This is material that has been stable, has been in approximately the same configuration, for so long that it contains within its structure a record of conditions on the early Earth that can be found nowhere else. This is known. This is established science. What is less well known, and what is the subject of active research, is what the unusual properties of this ancient lithospheric root mean for the behavior of the overlying landscape. How does having 2 billion-year-old mantle material directly beneath the surface affect the geophysical properties of the crust above? How does it affect the movement of fluids through the rock, the distribution of heat, the pattern of seismic activity, the behavior of the geomagnetic field? These are questions that geophysicists and geologists are working on, and the answers that are beginning to emerge suggest that the Kimberley's position on this ancient stable craton gives it properties that are, in certain respects, genuinely unusual among the continents of the world. The Aboriginal stories about the deep country, the country that goes down beneath the country that anyone can walk on, the country that goes so far down that it touches something ancient and different, may be pointing, in their own terms, to the reality of this extraordinarily ancient geological foundation. The elders may have detected, through generations of observation of how this landscape behaves, properties of the deep geology that express themselves in subtle but detectable ways at the surface. Properties that science is now beginning to characterize and explain. This is speculative. The science in this area is genuinely early stage, but it is worth noting that the pattern we have seen repeatedly in the Kimberley story of Aboriginal knowledge pointing to something real that science subsequently confirms gives us some reason to take the deeper claims seriously while we wait for the evidence to develop. And the elders are nothing if not patient. They have been waiting for the scientific establishment to catch up to them for a very long time now. Let us now turn to a specific incident that, more than perhaps any other single event, crystallized the relationship between Aboriginal warnings about the Kimberley Underground and the scientific attention that those warnings deserve. This is an event that happened relatively recently, that was documented by multiple parties, and that has had significant consequences for how both the scientific community and the broader public understand the knowledge that the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley carry. In the early years of the 21st century, a mining company undertaking exploration activities in a part of the Kimberley began drilling in an area that the Aboriginal custodians of that country had specifically identified as a site of underground significance. The custodians had warned against drilling in this location. They had described it as a place where what lies beneath the ground was not to be disturbed. They had used the language of their knowledge tradition to explain why, and they had been, as Aboriginal custodians are so often in such situations, overruled. The drilling proceeded, and within a relatively short period of time, the drill rig encountered something unexpected. A void. A cavity in the rock at a depth that the Geological survey had not predicted, that was not consistent with the geological model the mining company had been working with. The drill string dropped into the void, causing damage to the equipment. The drill hole had to be abandoned. Now, voids in cave country are not unknown. They are not always predictable. Their existence is not in itself mysterious. But the fact that the Aboriginal custodians had warned specifically about this site, had identified it as a place where what lies beneath was unusual, and that the drilling had confirmed the existence of an unusual subsurface feature at exactly the location described, attracted attention. Researchers who became aware of the incident began asking questions. What else had the custodians said about this site? What did the broader body of knowledge about underground features in this area say? Were there other sites in the region where similar warnings had been given? The answers were significant. The void encountered by the drill rig was, it turned out, part of a much more extensive system of subsurface voids and caves that extended across a considerable area. The Aboriginal custodians had knowledge of multiple sites across this system. They had specific information about the extent of the void system, about which surface areas were underlain by voids and which were on solid ground, and about specific locations within the system that were of particular significance. When this knowledge was systematically collected and compared with the results of subsequent geophysical surveys, the degree of correspondence was remarkable. The areas identified by the custodians as underlain by voids were, in the large majority of cases, confirmed by the geophysical surveys to be just that. The areas described as solid ground were, again in the large majority of cases, confirmed to be underlain by solid rock. The degree of accuracy was far beyond what could be explained by guessing or by general knowledge that cave country contains caves. What the custodians had was a detailed, location-specific map of a complex subsurface geological system, a map that had been accumulated, maintained, and transmitted across generations, and that was accurate at a level of precision that modern geophysical surveys required significant technical investment to confirm. The implications for mining exploration in the region were immediately apparent. If the Aboriginal custodians' knowledge of subsurface void systems was this reliable, then incorporating that knowledge into the early stages of exploration and planning could save mining companies significant amounts of time, money, and equipment damage. But the implications went much further than the practical considerations of the mining industry. They raised a fundamental question about the nature of the knowledge itself. How could people, without boreholes, without geophysical instruments, without any of the tools of modern subsurface investigation, know where the voids were? What was the mechanism by which this knowledge had been acquired and maintained over the generations? Several explanations have been proposed. One is that the knowledge derives from direct observation, that Aboriginal people did, at some point, physically enter these cave systems and map them, and that the knowledge of where the caves are was accumulated through direct exploration and maintained through oral transmission. This is possible. We know that Aboriginal people explored caves. We know they descended into cave systems. We know they made art in underground locations that required deliberate navigation to reach. But this explanation alone does not fully account for the level of detail and accuracy of the knowledge. Cave systems are complex. Their extent is not always predictable from their entrances. And the knowledge that the custodians held included information about parts of the system that apparently had no accessible entry points on the surface, that could only be reached by borehole. A second explanation is that the knowledge derives from indirect observation, that over many generations of living in and moving through this landscape, Aboriginal people developed the ability to read surface signs that indicate subsurface voids. Things like the distribution of specific plant species that are associated with different geological substrates, the behavior of water in heavy rain, the occurrence of subtle surface depressions and collapses, the distribution of specific fauna that are associated with cave environments, the sound of the ground underfoot, which differs subtly over voids compared to solid rock, in ways that are detectable to a person who knows what to listen for. This explanation is more satisfying, and it is consistent with the general principle of what Aboriginal ecological knowledge is. It is not mystical. It is empirical. It is based on observation, but it is observation that has been systematically conducted over 50,000 years, and that has been systematically encoded and transmitted in ways that allow the observations of one generation to be available to many subsequent generations without requiring each generation to conduct the observation from scratch. Over 50,000 years, you can learn a great deal about what the surface behavior of a landscape tells you about what is happening beneath it. You can develop a body of knowledge about the signs and indicators of subsurface features that is comprehensive, detailed, and reliable. And you can encode that knowledge in ways, stories, songs, ceremonies, physical walks through the country that make it available to your descendants, who will test it against their own observation and refine it further. This is what the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley did. And what they ended up with, after 50,000 years, is a knowledge system about the underground of their country that is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The third explanation is the most speculative, but it is the one that some researchers, particularly those who have spent significant time working closely with Aboriginal custodians in the Kimberley, have begun to take seriously. It is the possibility that the knowledge derives, at least in part, from something about human perception that modern science has not fully characterized. The possibility that people who spend their entire lives in deep relationship with a specific landscape, who attend to that landscape with an intensity and a quality of attention that most modern people never achieve, develop perceptual capacities that allow them to detect features of the landscape, including subsurface features, in ways that we do not currently understand. This is not a claim about supernatural powers. It is a claim about the full range of human perceptual capacity, and about what becomes possible when that capacity is developed through sustained, deliberate practice over many generations, in an environment where accurate perception of the landscape has direct survival consequences. The science of human perception is still evolving. The range of stimuli that human sensory systems can detect, the kinds of information that the brain integrates without conscious awareness, the extent to which expert practitioners in any domain perceive things that novices miss, these are all areas where our understanding has changed significantly in recent decades. It is at least possible that people who have been developing their perceptual relationship with a specific landscape for 50,000 years have capacities that our current science does not fully account for. The elders, when asked about this, tend to describe it in terms that are consistent with this possibility. They describe paying attention to the country in ways that involve the full body, not just the eyes and the ears. They describe learning to notice subtle things about the way the ground feels underfoot, the way water behaves after rain, the way animals move through certain areas, the way plants grow or fail to grow in specific locations. They describe a quality of attention to the landscape that develops over a lifetime of practice and that allows experienced custodians to perceive things about their country that visitors simply cannot see. Whether or not this capacity involves anything beyond what current neuroscience can account for, its practical consequences are clear. The people who develop it can perceive things about the Kimberley landscape that modern instruments subsequently confirm. The knowledge they have accumulated through 50,000 years of this kind of attention is real, specific, and accurate. This is the story of the Kimberley Underground, not a simple story. Not a story that fits neatly into either the framework of Western science or the framework of Aboriginal knowledge. A story that exists in the dialogue between them. A story that is still being told. As the researchers continue their surveys, as the elders continue to share what can appropriately be shared, as the evidence continues to accumulate, and as the gap between what was always known and what is newly discovered continues, slowly and remarkably, to close. Now we come to the question of what this means for the broader conversation about ancient knowledge traditions. About what the Kimberley story tells us. Not just about Australia, but about human knowledge, about how we understand the past, about what we might be missing when we dismiss the testimony of cultures whose ways of knowing we do not fully understand. The Kimberley is not unique. Across the world, there are Indigenous knowledge traditions that have been making specific empirical claims about landscapes and environments that Western science has been slow to take seriously, and that are, upon examination, turning out to contain accurate information that the scientific record is now confirming. The traditional ecological knowledge of Arctic indigenous peoples about the behavior of sea ice has been found to contain accurate observations about long-term patterns in ice behavior that instrumental records, which only go back a century or so, had missed. The knowledge of Pacific Islander navigators about the behavior of ocean swells, currents, and winds has been found to be highly accurate and has informed modern oceanographic understanding of Pacific circulation patterns. The knowledge of Amazonian indigenous peoples about the ecology of the rainforest has repeatedly outpaced the understanding of visiting ecologists, who find that the indigenous peoples know where species are to be found, how they behave, what their relationships are with other species, in a detail and accuracy that takes years of intensive scientific survey to approach. In each of these cases, the pattern is the same. Knowledge accumulated through sustained, transgenerational observation of a specific environment, encoded and transmitted through cultural practices developed specifically to preserve it, turns out to contain accurate empirical information that the methods of Western science are only recently beginning to confirm. But the Kimberley case is distinctive in two respects. First, it is the oldest. The Aboriginal Australian knowledge tradition is the oldest continuous knowledge tradition on Earth. The temporal depth of its observation exceeds that of any other Indigenous knowledge tradition by a significant margin. The knowledge it contains has been tested and refined over longer than the existence of any other human cultural institution. Second, the things it describes are not just ecological, they are geological. They are about the deep structure of the Earth, about processes operating over geological timescales, about features of the landscape that are not accessible to ordinary surface observation. The accuracy of the knowledge about these things is therefore more surprising, more difficult to explain in terms of conventional surface observation, and more suggestive of processes of knowledge acquisition that we do not fully understand. The elders of the Kimberley have been saying for 50,000 years that what lies beneath this country is real, is significant, and deserves attention. The scientists have finally looked, and what they have found is that the elders were right, not approximately, not metaphorically, specifically and accurately right about a set of underground features that modern technology is only now able to confirm. What does this tell us about the knowledge that has not yet been confirmed? About the claims that the elders make which science has not yet found the means to check? About the aspects of the Kimberley underground about which the custodians speak with certainty, but which the boreholes and the geophysical surveys have not yet reached? It suggests that we should listen carefully, with the respect that 50,000 years of accurate knowledge about this landscape deserves. It suggests that when an elder says there is something significant beneath a particular place, the appropriate response of the scientific community is not to dismiss this as folklore, but to ask what kind of something, and to apply whatever resources are available to finding out whether the elder is right. This is beginning to happen. Slowly, unevenly, against the resistance of institutions that were built on the assumption that the knowledge that matters is the knowledge that is written down, that is produced by credentialed experts, that passes through the processes of peer review and publication. But it is happening. And when it happens, when the borehole hits the void that the elder said was there, when the geophysical survey confirms the underground connection that the story described, when the isotope analysis verifies the age of the water that the custodian told you had been there since before the world was remade, the scientists present describe the experience in terms that are surprisingly similar to each other, regardless of their discipline, regardless of their background, regardless of how skeptical they were going in. They describe it as humbling. They describe a shift in perspective that is not just about this particular finding, but about the nature of knowledge itself, about how much it is possible to know, and by what means, about the extraordinary capacity of the human mind and the human community, applied with sustained attention over a long enough time to understand the world. The Kimberley is one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. The people who have lived here the longest have known it the best. And the story of what they know, and of what the scientists are finally finding, is a story that challenges us to think differently about what knowledge is, where it comes from, and what we might learn if we were willing to listen to those who have been watching the world for longer than our own traditions can remember. Let us now go deeper into the specific research that has emerged from the collaboration between Aboriginal knowledge holders and scientific researchers in the Kimberley. Because while the broad picture is extraordinary, the specific details are even more so. Each individual discovery in this landscape is a chapter in a story that is still very much being written. One of the most important ongoing collaborations involves the Woonambal Aboriginal Corporation and researchers from several Australian universities who have been working together to document and understand the traditional ecological knowledge of the Woonambal people about the hydrology of their country. The Woonambal are the traditional custodians of the northwestern Kimberley, an area that includes some of the most remote and least studied landscape in Australia. The collaboration began when researchers from the Groundwater Group at a Western Australian university noticed that there were discrepancies between their hydrological models and the actual behaviour of the water system in the Woonambal country. The models, based on standard geological surveys, predicted certain patterns of water availability and certain responses to rainfall. The actual patterns were different. The groundwater behaved in ways that the models did not predict. When the researchers raised this with the Woonambal they were told, politely but firmly, that the models were wrong, that the country did not behave the way the models said because the models did not understand the connections. That the water did not simply go where the surface geology said it should go, because the surface geology was not the only thing controlling it. That beneath the surface, there were connections between different parts of the catchment that the Geological Survey had not captured. The researchers listened, they revised their models, and in the process, they began working with Wunumbal knowledge holders to map the connections that the traditional knowledge described. The result was a new hydrological model of the Wunumbal country that incorporated the traditional knowledge about underground connections and that made predictions about water system behavior that was subsequently confirmed by observation. The model is not complete. The Wunumbal country is vast and complex, and the full mapping of its underground hydrology will take many more years. But the integration of traditional knowledge with scientific modeling has already produced a substantially better understanding of how the water system works than either approach could have achieved alone. Similar collaborative work is being done in the Fitzroy Valley, in the southern Kimberley, where the Bunuba, Gunyandi, and Nyakina peoples are the traditional custodians. The Fitzroy River, which drains much of the southern Kimberley, is the largest undammed river in northern Australia, and it is under increasing pressure from proposed irrigation and agricultural development. The traditional custodians of the Fitzroy Valley have been among the most active and vocal advocates for the protection of this river, and their knowledge about the river's behavior, its connections to underground water systems, and the ecological relationships it sustains has been increasingly recognized as an important body of evidence in the debates about its future. Bunuba elders have described the Fitzroy as a living entity and have used this framing to argue that its health cannot be understood by looking at the river itself in isolation, that the river is connected to the country around it, above and below, in ways that mean changes to any part of the system will affect all other parts, that the underground, the above ground, and the aquatic are all aspects of the same system, and that the traditional knowledge of the custodians encompasses all of these dimensions. This framing, which seemed to non-Aboriginal Australians to be an expression of spiritual or cultural values rather than empirical knowledge, has been increasingly confirmed by the ecological science of the Fitzroy system. The Fitzroy's water regime, including both the seasonal floods and the dry season flows, is sustained by a complex interaction between surface water and groundwater that operates at a system level. Changes to the groundwater system, through extraction for irrigation, for example, can affect the flow regime of the river in ways that are not immediately obvious but that become apparent over time. The traditional knowledge that describes these connections is, as the science confirms, describing something real. The Fitzroy also connects to what might be the most significant single element of the Kimberley's underground story, the Canning Basin aquifer system. The Canning Basin, which underlies much of the southern and central Kimberley, contains an enormous volume of groundwater, water that accumulated during wetter periods in the deep past, and that has been, to a significant extent, disconnected from the contemporary water cycle for thousands of years. It is, in a very real sense, ancient water. Water that fell on an Australia that is gone, that has been stored in the rock for a very long time, and that is now being looked at with increasing interest as a potential water resource for agricultural and industrial development in one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth. The traditional custodians of the Canning Basin country, including the Martu people whose traditional country extends across the Gibson and Great Sandy Deserts that border the basin, have specific knowledge about the underground water of their country. They know where it is. They know where it comes close to the surface. They know how it moves. They know which clay pans and soaks are connected to the deep water system and which are fed only by direct rainfall. This knowledge has been essential for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Without reliable access to water, human habitation of this country would be impossible. The knowledge of where the water is, encoded in the dreaming tracks and the landscape stories of the Martu and other custodians, is not metaphorical. It is a map, and it is an accurate map. The proposed development of the Canning Basin aquifer as an agricultural resource raises profound questions about the implications of removing large quantities of ancient, non-renewable water from a system that traditional custodians have been managing sustainably for 50,000 years. The traditional custodians do not manage this water by extraction. They manage it by knowing where it is, by knowing its connections and its limits, and by organizing their patterns of movement and use around the reality of the water system as it exists. This form of management has maintained a sustainable relationship between human habitation and water resources in this country for 50,000 years. It is being asked to give way to a form of resource use that could irreversibly alter the system within a matter of decades. This is not just an environmental issue, it is a knowledge issue. The people who know this water system best, who have the deepest and most detailed understanding of how it works and what happens when it is disturbed, are the traditional custodians. And their knowledge says that what is proposed would be a mistake. Not a small mistake, not a mistake that could be corrected, but a permanent alteration of a system that has been in a state of sustainable balance for longer than any other managed landscape on Earth. The argument for listening to this knowledge is not just ethical, it is practical. If the science is catching up to the traditional knowledge, finding, discovery after discovery, that the custodians knew things about this landscape that the instruments are now confirming, then the prudent course of action is to take very seriously the warnings of the custodians about what will happen if the underground of the Kimberley is disturbed in ways that are inconsistent with the knowledge that has kept this country in balance for 50,000 years. This is a claim that the scientific community is not fully comfortable with. The science of groundwater extraction and aquifer management is well developed. The hydrological models for the Canning Basin are sophisticated. The predicted impacts of proposed extraction levels are, according to the standard scientific assessment, manageable within certain parameters. But the standard scientific assessment is based on data that goes back a century at most. It is based on models of a system that the scientists have known about for a century and been studying intensively for perhaps 40 or 50 years. The traditional knowledge is based on 50,000 years of observation. The scientists are looking at a snapshot, the custodians are looking at a film, and the film, according to the custodians, shows things that the snapshot does not reveal. Shows how the system has behaved over long cycles that the instrumental record cannot capture. Shows how disturbance at one point in the system propagates to other points in ways that only become visible over timescales longer than the scientific record. Shows what happened the last time, thousands of years ago, when conditions in the Kimberley changed dramatically, when the climate shifted and the water system responded, and how long it took for balance to be restored. This is the kind of knowledge that you can only accumulate over 50,000 years of watching. And the people who have been watching are trying to tell us what they see. We should listen, not instead of using the scientific instruments, in addition to using them. In a genuine dialogue between the knowledge of the elders and the knowledge of the instruments, where each is used to interrogate and refine the other, and where the aim is a combined understanding that is better than either could achieve alone. This is what is beginning to happen in the Kimberley. Slowly, unevenly, with many false starts and misunderstandings and moments of frustration on both sides. But it is happening, and the results, when they come, are extraordinary. Every field season that passes brings new findings, new confirmations of things the elders knew, new discoveries about the underground that illuminate what the stories have been trying to tell. New moments in which the instruments catch up to the knowledge, and the scientists present feel that shift in perspective that so many of them describe in the same terms. The Kimberley is a place where, if you are paying attention, you can feel the weight of time. You can stand in a landscape that has been inhabited by human beings for 50,000 years and understand, viscerally, what that means. The continuity of habitation, the unbroken chain of transmission. The fact that every story told around a fire in this country tonight is part of a tradition that was already ancient when the first stone circle was built in Europe. That weight of time is not just cultural, it is geological. The rock beneath your feet is older than life on land. The water beneath the rock has been there since before the first human walked on this continent. The connections between the surface and the deep, between the above and the below, between the living landscape and the ancient geology, are real connections. They are not metaphors. They are not spiritual abstractions. They are facts about how this piece of the earth works. And the knowledge of those facts, the specific, detailed, empirically grounded knowledge of how this underground connects to this surface, how this aquifer relates to this river, how this geological feature creates this pattern of behavior in the landscape above it. That knowledge was accumulated, maintained, and transmitted by the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists came. They brought their instruments, they drilled their boreholes and flew their surveys and analyzed their isotopes and mapped their aquifers. And what they found, again and again, was that the elders knew. That the stories were right, that the warnings were accurate, that the 50,000-year-old knowledge of what lies beneath the Kimberley was, in the important ways, correct. This is one of the most extraordinary facts about the world that we have learned in the last few decades. It is a fact that should change how we think about knowledge, about time, about the relationship between human cultures and the landscapes they inhabit. It is a fact that the Kimberley has been trying to teach us for a very long time. And it is a fact that is still unfolding. The boreholes are still going down, the surveys are still flying, the sediment cores are still being analyzed. The collaborations between scientists and elders are still producing new findings, new confirmations, new moments of convergence between the knowledge that was always there and the knowledge that is newly arrived. The story of what lies beneath the Kimberley is not finished. It may never be finished, in the sense that there will always be more to discover, always more to understand, always more depth to plumb in a landscape this old and this complex. But it is a story that is being told now, in the collaboration between the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and the youngest major knowledge tradition on Earth, and the things that story is revealing are, in every sense of the word, profound. The elders warned about what was beneath the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and what they found was that the elders were right, not just about one thing, about many things. About water and caves and geological connections and underground hazards and the deep memory of ancient rock. They were right because they paid attention. Because they developed ways of knowing that are robust across time, that can preserve specific empirical information about a landscape through the deaths of individuals and the disruptions of history and the changes of climate over millennia. Because they understood something that the scientific tradition is only beginning to appreciate, that knowing a place takes time, more time than any single generation, more time than any single institution, more time than any single tradition that has been operating for less than a few centuries. Knowing a place, really knowing it, in the depth that the Kimberley demands, takes 50,000 years, and the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley have taken that time. They have paid that attention. And what they know is extraordinary. We are the beneficiaries of that knowledge now, if we choose to be, if we choose to listen, if we are willing to sit with the elders and hear what they have to say about the country they have watched for 50 millennia, if we are willing to bring our instruments and our models and our laboratories and our peer review processes into genuine dialogue with a knowledge tradition that predates all of our institutions by factors that should inspire, in any honest person, genuine awe, the underground of the Kimberley is, literally and figuratively, deeper than we knew. The knowledge of those depths is older than we imagined. And the work of understanding, really understanding what lies beneath this ancient country is just beginning. The next borehole will go down, the next survey will fly, the next elder will share something that the science will, in due course, confirm. And another chapter will be added to the longest story ever told about any landscape on Earth. The story of what lies beneath the Kimberley, told for 50,000 years by the people who knew, and now, slowly, being told again by the instruments we have brought to confirm what they always knew was there. The country remembers. And now, finally, we are learning to listen to what it says. In the years that have followed the initial publications about underground water systems in the Kimberley, a quiet revolution has been underway in how researchers approach this landscape. It is not a revolution that has made headlines in the mainstream press, largely because it is happening in the slow, painstaking way that genuine scientific progress usually happens, through boreholes and bore reports, through conference papers and research grants, Through field seasons that require weeks of travel in difficult country and collaborations that require years of relationship building before they are ready to produce results. But it is a revolution nonetheless, a fundamental rethinking of what this landscape is, of what it contains, and of what we need to do to understand it properly. Part of that rethinking involves the question of what to do with the knowledge that the elders hold. There is now broad scientific agreement that Aboriginal traditional knowledge is a legitimate and valuable source of empirical information about the Kimberley. There is agreement that this knowledge should be incorporated into scientific research programs. There is agreement that collaboration with Aboriginal custodians produces better science than research conducted without their involvement. But there is less agreement about some of the more challenging implications of this recognition, about what it means for property rights over the knowledge, about who gets to decide how it is used and for what purposes, about how to ensure that the communities who hold the knowledge benefit from its incorporation into scientific and commercial applications, about how to balance the need for scientific openness and replication with the cultural protocols that govern the appropriate use of knowledge that belongs to specific custodians of specific country. These are not simple questions, and the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley are under no obligation to resolve them in ways that primarily serve the interests of the scientific and commercial institutions that want access to their knowledge. The knowledge belongs to the custodians. The terms on which it is shared are theirs to set. The benefit from its use should flow back to the communities who maintained it through generations of effort and sacrifice, to the point where it is now valuable enough to attract the attention of universities and mining companies and government agencies. The Kimberley Land Council and the various Aboriginal corporations that represent the traditional custodians of the Kimberley have been working on these questions for years. They have developed protocols for research collaboration that are designed to ensure that traditional knowledge remains under the control of its custodians, that the communities involved give informed consent to research activities, that they receive appropriate recognition and compensation for their contributions, and that the research itself is conducted in ways that are consistent with their cultural values and their obligations to country. These protocols are not always comfortable for researchers trained in a tradition of open access and unrestricted inquiry, but they are the legitimate expression of the rights of the knowledge holders, and they are, in the long run, the only basis on which a genuine and respectful collaboration can be built. The research that is producing the most extraordinary results in the Kimberley is being conducted within these protocols, in partnerships that have been built on trust, developed over years of careful, respectful engagement. The alternative, the extraction of traditional knowledge without appropriate consent or compensation, the use of knowledge from one tradition to produce intellectual property claimed by another, is not just ethically wrong. It is increasingly legally problematic, and it is scientifically counterproductive, because the communities whose collaboration produces the best knowledge are the ones who will only collaborate under conditions of genuine respect and genuine benefit sharing. The future of Kimberley research, the research that will produce the most significant findings about what lies beneath this ancient landscape, will be done in partnership, in a dialogue between the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and some of the youngest institutions in Australian science, and the terms of that dialogue will be set appropriately by the people who have the most at stake. The custodians whose country it is, whose knowledge it is, and who have been watching this landscape for 50,000 years while the rest of the world was just getting started. There is something in the Kimberley that resists easy summary. Something that you can feel, if you have spent time there, in the quality of the air and the light and the silence. Something in the scale of the landscape, in the age of the rock, in the weight of what you know about how long people have been here, that makes the ordinary frameworks of understanding feel inadequate. The elders who hold the knowledge of this country know something about that feeling. They have language for it. They have ceremonies for it. They have ways of being in this country that are shaped by 50,000 years of living with the particular quality of presence that the Kimberley demands. We are newcomers to this conversation. We arrived recently with our instruments and our models and our publications. We found a landscape that was already deeply known. We found a body of knowledge about that landscape that was already sophisticated, already comprehensive, already tested and refined across a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of our own knowledge tradition. The least we can do is listen, and to acknowledge, with the humility that the evidence demands, that the warnings were right. That what lies beneath the Kimberley is real and significant, and was known to the people who lived above it for as long as people have lived there, and that the work of understanding it properly, of bringing the instruments into genuine dialogue with the knowledge, has barely begun. The boreholes will keep going down, the surveys will keep flying, the elders will keep sharing what can appropriately be shared, and the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley, the longest story ever told about any landscape on Earth, will keep being told, as it has been told, for 50,000 years by the people who knew, deep in the gorges of the Kimberley, where the ancient red walls rise hundreds of meters on either side of you and the sky is a narrow ribbon of blue far above, time feels different. The rock around you was here before the first fish breathed air. The river at your feet has been cutting this gorge for longer than the continent you are standing on has been in its current position on the surface of the earth. The silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of time itself. The people who first walked into these gorges brought with them everything they needed to survive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Not in their packs, in their heads, in the stories and songs and ceremonies that encoded the knowledge of generations of predecessors. In the dreaming tracks that mapped the landscape and its resources and its dangers in a form that could be memorized, transmitted, and updated by each generation without the use of any technology beyond language and ceremony and the landscape itself. That knowledge is still here, in the minds of the elders who are still alive, in the ceremonies that are still performed, in the dreaming tracks that are still walked, in the stories that are still told, at night, around fires, in the country that those stories describe. And now it is in the databases of university research groups, in the reports of government groundwater agencies, in the publications of geologists and hydrologists and archaeologists who have spent years in this country, listening to the elders, looking where they were directed, and finding, time after time, that what the elders told them to look for was there. The convergence is ongoing. The story is unfinished. The boreholes have not yet reached the bottom of what the country holds. The surveys have not yet mapped every connection, every void, every underground channel that the knowledge describes. The dialogue between the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and the methods of modern science has barely begun to produce its full results. But what has already emerged is enough to say, with confidence, that the Aboriginal elders of the Kimberley were right, that what they warned about was real, that the 50,000-year transmission of knowledge about this landscape was not just cultural heritage, it was empirical knowledge, accurate, specific, and extraordinarily detailed knowledge about a landscape so old and so complex that it will take science many more decades to fully confirm what the elders already knew. They warned. We finally looked, and the country, patient as it always has been, patient as rock, is patient. Patient as water that has been sitting in the dark for 40,000 years is patient. The country showed us what it had always been holding. The warnings were right, the knowledge was real, and the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley is, at long last, beginning to be heard by those who need to hear it most. Not because the elders needed us to validate their knowledge. They did not. The knowledge was valid before we arrived. It was valid when the last ice age ended. It was valid when the sea rose and covered the ancient coastline. It was valid through every disruption and catastrophe and change that this landscape has experienced in the last 50,000 years. The validation, such as it is for our benefit, so that we can understand what this knowledge is and what it represents, so that we can begin to act in accordance with it, to make decisions about this landscape that reflect the depth of understanding that is available to us if we are willing to engage with it. So that the warnings that the elders have been giving, not just about what is beneath the country, but about what happens when the country is not treated with the care and attention it requires, can be heard and heeded before it is too late to matter. The Kimberley has been here for 3 billion years. The people who know it have been here for 50,000. The scientists who are now beginning to understand it have been here for a few decades. The balance of knowledge in this place is very clear, and the appropriate response to that balance is very clear. Listen. Look where you are directed. Be humble about what you think you know, and pay attention to the country in the fullest sense of that phrase. Pay attention to what it is doing. Pay attention to what is happening beneath the surface. Pay attention to the connections and the movements and the slow, ancient rhythms of a landscape that has been forming and reforming for longer than any of us can imagine. The elders have been paying that attention for 50,000 years. And what they have learned is what we need to know about the Kimberley, about Australia, about what it means to inhabit a landscape with the kind of sustained, committed, reverential attention that 50,000 years of continuous culture represents. The ground beneath the Kimberley holds secrets that science is only beginning to unlock. But they were never secrets to the people who lived above them. They were knowledge, carefully maintained, faithfully transmitted, patiently offered to anyone willing to listen. Are we willing to listen? That is the question that the Kimberley poses to everyone who comes here. And the answer we give to it will determine not just what we learn about this landscape, but what we learn about ourselves. The boreholes go down, the ancient water comes up, the elders nod, and the country, patient as it has always been, waits to see what we will do next. There is a concept in geology called deep time. It was coined, or at least popularized, by the writer John McPhee to describe the almost ungraspable span of geological history. The billions of years during which the Earth has been forming and reforming, the mountains rising and eroding, the oceans opening and closing, the continents drifting across the face of the planet in the slow, majestic choreography of plate tectonics. Deep time is the time of the rock, the time of the planet, the time that makes human history, even the longest human history, look like the thinnest possible film on the surface of something immeasurably older. The Kimberley is a place where deep time is not an abstraction. It is visible in the cliff faces that line the gorges. It is legible in the rock formations that have been exposed by millions of years of erosion. It is present in the chemical signatures of the water that comes up from the deep bore holes. When you stand in the Kimberley and look at the rock around you, you are looking at deep time made solid, made real, made tangible in a way that very few landscapes on Earth can match. And then you realize that in this landscape, human beings have been present for 50,000 years, that the deep time of the rock and the deep time of the human story overlap here in a way that is extraordinary, that the oldest continuous human culture on Earth has been embedded in one of the oldest rock formations on Earth for longer than any other human community has been anywhere. This overlap is not accidental. The Kimberley's geological antiquity, its stability, its extreme remoteness from the disruptions that have transformed most of the world's landscapes over the past few thousand years, are part of why the Aboriginal cultures of this region have been able to maintain a continuous relationship with it for so long. The country was old when the people arrived, and it has changed relatively little since. The same gorges, the same rivers, the same underground systems, altered in detail by the slow processes of geological time, but recognizable in their basic structure as the same features that the first human inhabitants of this landscape learned to know and to use and to care for. This continuity is itself a kind of deep time. The continuity of human relationship with a landscape, the continuity of knowledge about a place, the unbroken thread of observation and transmission that connects the present custodians of the Kimberley with the first people who walked into this country 50,000 years ago, found the springs and the rock shelters and the underground water, learned the patterns and the dangers and the connections, and began the process of encoding that knowledge in a form that would outlast them. They could not have known, those first inhabitants of the Kimberley, that their knowledge would still be alive and active 50,000 years later, that their descendants would still be living in the same country, still performing the ceremonies, still walking the dreaming tracks, still telling the stories that described the features of a landscape they all knew intimately. They could not have anticipated the disruptions that would come. The Ice Age ending, the sea rising, the climate shifting, the arrival of other people with entirely different ways of understanding the world, the violence and the dispossession and the attempts to erase everything they had built and maintained and transmitted. They built something that survived all of that, not in writing, not in stone inscriptions, in the most fragile and the most resilient of all possible media, in the minds and the hearts of their descendants, in the ceremonies that encode knowledge in a form that is simultaneously cultural and spiritual and practical, in the songs that map the country in a way that is both aesthetic and geographical, in the stories that preserve empirical observations about the landscape in a form that is both entertaining and educational, in the dreaming tracks that link specific knowledge to specific places in the landscape, creating a memory system that is geographically distributed and therefore robust against the loss of any single knowledge holder. This is an extraordinary technological achievement. As extraordinary, in its own way, as any of the technological achievements that the Western tradition celebrates. The Sydney Opera House is an extraordinary achievement of architecture. The Hubble Space Telescope is an extraordinary achievement of engineering. The double helix is an extraordinary achievement of biology. But the maintenance of accurate empirical knowledge about a specific landscape across 50,000 years of human history, through ice ages and sea level rises and climate changes and colonization, is an achievement of knowledge technology that surpasses all of these. Not in its visual drama, not in its immediate practical impact, but in its depth, in its durability, in what it tells us about what human minds and human communities are capable of when they apply themselves, over the longest possible timescales, to the most fundamental of all human tasks, understanding the world. The Kimberley is the best example we have of this achievement. Not the only example, but the best. Because it is the oldest, and because the landscape it describes is one of the oldest and most complex on Earth, and because the convergence between what the knowledge says and what the science finds is documented in a way that is increasingly detailed and increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every time a scientist confirms something that an elder already knew, it adds another data point to the evidence for the reliability of this knowledge system. Every time a borehole confirms an underground connection that the dreaming tracks describe, every time a survey reveals a geological feature that a story already mapped, every time an isotope analysis confirms the age of water that the custodians said was ancient, the evidence accumulates. The case becomes stronger. The claim that this knowledge is real, specific, and accurate becomes harder to argue with. And the implications extend beyond the Kimberley. If a knowledge tradition that is 50,000 years old can preserve accurate empirical information about subsurface geological features in a specific landscape, what else might ancient knowledge traditions around the world be preserving? What might we be missing because we have not thought to check whether the stories of ancient peoples correspond to the findings of modern science? This is a question that a growing number of researchers are beginning to take seriously. And the answers that are beginning to emerge are suggesting that the Kimberley case is not unique, that it is an extreme example of something that is actually widespread. The encoding of empirical knowledge about landscapes and environments in the cultural traditions of the people who have inhabited those landscapes for extended periods. The implications for how we conduct science in Indigenous territories, for how we understand the history of human knowledge, and for how we approach the urgent environmental questions of our time are profound. We have access to a body of knowledge about the Earth that we have largely failed to consult. A body of knowledge held by the indigenous peoples of the world, accumulated over timescales that our own knowledge tradition cannot match, about landscapes that our own surveys have only recently begun to map. The Kimberley is teaching us that this knowledge is real, that it is accurate, that it is worth listening to, and that the time to listen is now, while the knowledge holders are still among us, while the knowledge is still alive and active and available to be heard. The elders warned about what lies beneath the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and what they found was that the elders were right. But that is not the end of the story. That is the beginning. Because the next question is, what do we do with this? How do we incorporate what the elders know into how we manage this landscape? How do we ensure that the decisions being made about the future of the Kimberley, about water extraction and mining and pastoral use and tourism, reflect the depth of understanding that is available to us? How do we make sure that the knowledge that has been maintained at such extraordinary cost and through such extraordinary commitment is not just confirmed by science and then set aside while the decisions that matter are made by people who arrived here yesterday? These are the questions that the Kimberley is posing to Australia, and Australia is slowly and unevenly beginning to answer them. The recognition of native title, the collaborative research programs, the co-management arrangements for national parks and conservation areas, the growing incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge into environmental assessment processes. These are steps, imperfect, incomplete, often frustratingly slow steps, but steps in a direction that the evidence demands we go. And the evidence comes from the boreholes and the surveys and the isotope analyses, yes, but it also comes from something simpler and more direct. It comes from the fact that the elders were right, that when they said something was there, it was there, that the warnings they gave were accurate, that the knowledge they held was real. This is the lesson of the Kimberley underground. Not just about geology, not just about hydrology, not just about archaeology or ecology or any of the individual sciences that have been confirming pieces of the picture, but about knowledge itself, about what it is, where it comes from, how it is maintained, and what it is worth. The knowledge that the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley hold about what lies beneath their country is worth, in any practical sense, an extraordinary amount. It is worth the accurate mapping of a water system that would otherwise take decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to survey from scratch. It is worth the identification of geological hazards that could cost lives and equipment if they were encountered without warning. It is worth the biological inventory of cave systems that contain species found nowhere else on Earth. It is worth the climate record preserved in ancient water and sediment that can only be read if you know where to find it. But it is worth more than any of these individual items. It is worth what it represents. A demonstration that the human mind, applied with sustained attention over the longest possible timescales, can understand the world in ways that are not accessible by any other means. A demonstration that knowledge does not require instruments and publications and peer review to be real and accurate and valuable. A demonstration that the relationship between a people and a landscape, maintained with care and commitment across 50,000 years, produces a depth of understanding that commands respect and demands engagement. The elders of the Kimberley have earned that respect. Through every generation of careful observation and faithful transmission, through every ceremony and every song and every walk along a dreaming track that encoded another piece of the map of this extraordinary landscape, through the patience of 50,000 years of watching and knowing and waiting for someone else to finally look where they were pointing, the scientists have looked. And what they found is what was always there, what was always known, what the country has been holding in its rock and its water and its deep, ancient memory, waiting for the moment when the conversation could begin. The conversation has begun, the boreholes will keep going down, the surveys will keep flying, and the knowledge of the elders will keep guiding them, as it has always guided the people who paid attention to this country, deeper into the understanding of what lies beneath. The Kimberley is not finished with its secrets, but it has given us enough already to know that the people who warned us about them were telling the truth. It was always there. They always knew. And now, finally, so do we. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves telling before we reach its end. It is the dimension that is most difficult to discuss in scientific terms, and most important to the elders themselves. It is the dimension that the knowledge tradition calls the dreaming, and that outsiders sometimes call spirituality, but that is, at its core, something that defies easy categorization. The dreaming is not just a belief system. It is not just a set of stories about the creation of the world. It is not just a spiritual framework for understanding human existence. It is a relationship. A relationship between people and country that is so fundamental, so constitutive of who those people are and how they understand themselves, that to describe it as any one of these things is to miss something essential. The dreaming is the living connection between the present inhabitants of the country and everything that has happened in that country since the beginning. Not the beginning of human habitation, not the beginning of life. The beginning, the period when the world was being made, when the features of the landscape were being established by the movements of ancestral beings whose travels created the rivers and the mountains and the rock formations and the underground connections that the people of today are the custodians of. These ancestral beings did not just create the physical landscape. They established the laws that govern it, the relationships between different parts of it, the protocols for how the people who live within it are to behave toward each other and toward the country itself. And they encoded all of this in the dreaming, in a living record of the world that is accessible to those who know how to read it, who know the songs and the ceremonies and the stories that are the keys to its meaning. For the people of the Kimberley, the underground is not separate from the dreaming. The connections between the surface and the deep, the underground water systems, the cave formations, the ancient geology, all of these are aspects of the dreaming. They are part of the living record of what happened when the world was made. And the knowledge of them is not just scientific knowledge. Even if it functions as scientific knowledge, it is sacred knowledge, knowledge that carries responsibilities, knowledge that connects the person who holds it to the long chain of custodians who held it before them and to the country itself, which is, in the framework of the dreaming, a living entity with which the people are in permanent relationship. This is why the warnings about the Kimberley Underground are not just warnings about geological hazards. They are instructions about relationship. They are telling the custodians, and by extension anyone else who will listen, how to be in right relationship with this country, how to use its resources without damaging it, how to move through it without disrupting the connections that make it work, how to take from it what is needed without taking more than the system can sustain. When the elders say that certain underground sites should not be disturbed, they are saying something that is simultaneously sacred and practical. Sacred because the sites are part of the dreaming. Practical because the sites are features of a geological system that has real consequences if it is damaged. The two dimensions are not separate. They are aspects of the same thing. The relationship between the people and the country that the dreaming expresses and the geology embodies. This integration of the sacred and the practical is one of the things that makes the Aboriginal knowledge tradition so robust across time. When knowledge is encoded in a sacred framework, when the transmission of empirical information is embedded in ceremony and story and relationship with country, it is protected against the kind of casual dismissal or selective forgetting that affects purely utilitarian knowledge. You do not forget the songs that map the underground water because the songs are sacred. You do not disregard the warnings about dangerous underground sites because the warnings are part of the dreaming. The sacred dimension is, functionally, a protection mechanism for the empirical content of the knowledge. This is one of the things that researchers who have spent significant time working with Aboriginal knowledge traditions have come to appreciate. The spiritual and the empirical are not in tension in this tradition. They are in alignment. The dreaming is not a substitute for empirical observation of the world. It is a framework that encodes, protects, and transmits the results of empirical observation across the greatest possible spans of time. Understanding this changes how you read the warnings about the Kimberley Underground. When an elder says that a particular site should not be disturbed because it is a dreaming site, they are not just making a spiritual or cultural claim that can be weighed against the economic or scientific interest in disturbing it. They are making an empirical claim about the nature of that site, about its connections to other parts of the system, about the consequences of disturbance. And the evidence that has accumulated about the accuracy of Aboriginal knowledge about the Kimberley Underground suggests very strongly that those empirical claims should be taken seriously. The Kimberley is, in this sense, a test case. A test of whether Australian society, and the scientific community that advises it, is willing to take the empirical claims of Aboriginal knowledge seriously enough to let them influence the decisions that matter. not just as cultural considerations to be acknowledged and then set aside, as data, as evidence, as knowledge that has earned, through 50,000 years of accuracy, the right to be heard. The test is ongoing. The decisions about the Kimberley, about water extraction and mining and development and conservation are being made right now. And the knowledge of the elders is available to inform those decisions, if those making them choose to listen. The boreholes go down. The ancient water comes up. The elders know what is down there. The science is beginning to confirm it. And the country, patient as it has always been, is waiting to see what we will do. The Kimberley has been here for 3 billion years. The people who know it have been here for 50,000. We are newcomers. We arrived recently. We are learning. The question is whether we are learning fast enough, because the country does not wait for us to be ready. The pressures on the Kimberley are real and they are immediate. The demand for the water that the aquifers hold. The demand for the minerals that the ancient rock contains. The demand for the land itself, for agricultural and pastoral and tourist development. These are not future threats. They are present realities. And the knowledge of what happens when these demands are imposed on a landscape without proper understanding of its deep structure is knowledge that the elders hold, and that the science is slowly confirming. The warnings are still being given, the science is still accumulating, and the decisions about the Kimberley's future are still being made. Listen to the elders. Look where they are pointing, and understand that the deepest thing beneath the Kimberley is not the water, not the rock, not the ancient geology. It is the knowledge that has been maintained here in this country for 50,000 years, the knowledge that was always there, the knowledge that was always right. And now, at last, it is beginning to be heard. In the far northwestern corner of the Kimberley, where the land meets the sea in a landscape of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary age, there is a place the Wunumbal Gambera call home country. The tides here are among the highest in the world. Twice a day, the sea rushes in over the mudflats and tidal channels, covering ground that was exposed an hour before, retreating again to reveal a landscape glistening with moisture and alive with birds and fish and the specialized organisms that have adapted to this boundary zone between land and sea. This intertidal zone is one of the most productive marine environments on Earth. It is also one of the most ancient, in the sense that the geological formations beneath it have been accumulating and changing for so long that the history they contain is almost incomprehensible in its depth. And it is a landscape that the Wunumbal Gambera have known and managed and protected for tens of thousands of years. They know the tides, they know the seasons, they know which channels are safe to cross at which states of the tide. They know where the fish are, at which times of year, in response to which conditions. They know which stretches of mangrove forest are the nursery grounds for which species. They know how the intertidal zone changes in response to the cycles of rainfall and drought that govern this part of the Kimberley. They know, in short, everything that a person who has been paying close attention to this environment for their entire life, as their parents did, and their parents' parents, for 50,000 years, can know about it. And beneath this tidal landscape, as beneath the rest of the Kimberley, there is an underground. There are connections between the coastal environment and the inland. There are submarine springs where fresh groundwater emerges into the sea. There are geological features on the seafloor that are continuations of the rock formations on shore. There are caves and passages in the rock beneath the tidal zone that are flooded at high tide and exposed at low tide, environments that are extraordinarily challenging for life but that have been colonized over millions of years by organisms adapted to exactly this kind of extreme alternation. The Wunumbal Gambera know about these submarine springs. They know which areas of sea surface show the signs of freshwater emergence beneath, where the sea looks different, where the fish behave differently, where the water is cold. They know about the tidal caves, which ones can be safely entered at low tide and which ones are dangerous. They know about the geological connections between the coast and the inland that means certain coastal sites and certain inland sites are, in a very real sense, the same place expressed differently. When marine scientists began studying the coastal geology of the Wunumbal Gambera country, They found that the traditional knowledge corresponded with remarkable precision to what their surveys revealed. The submarine springs were where the custodians said they were. The tidal caves were described with an accuracy that suggested detailed, first-hand knowledge. The connections between the coastal and inland geology that the traditional knowledge implied were confirmed by the geological surveys. This is not surprising. Not anymore. The pattern is too consistent across too many different domains of knowledge about the Kimberley to be surprising. The elders know their country. They know it underground and above ground and underwater. They know it in all its seasons and all its states. They know it because they have been here, paying attention, for 50,000 years. What is striking about the coastal work is what it adds to the picture of Aboriginal knowledge about the Kimberley underground. Because the connection between the inland and the coastal underground, confirmed by the marine geological surveys, has implications for the hydrological model of the whole Kimberley system. The fresh groundwater that emerges from submarine springs on the Kimberley coast is water that has traveled from inland. It has filtered through the rock of the plateau, following geological pathways that connect the inland aquifer systems to the coastal zone. And those pathways, those connections between the inland and the coastal underground, are known to the Wunumbal Gambera. They are described in the traditional knowledge. They have been confirmed by the science. This matters for understanding the vulnerability of the coastal environment to changes in the inland water system. If you extract large quantities of groundwater from the inland aquifers, the reduction in the groundwater head could affect the submarine spring discharge on the coast. This could alter the salinity of the nearshore environment in ways that would affect the marine ecology. It could reduce the freshwater input to coastal wetlands in ways that would affect the birds and the fish and the other organisms that depend on them. The coastal and the inland are not separate. They are the same system. And the knowledge of that, the knowledge of the connections that link the inland and the coastal underground, is knowledge that matters for managing both. The elders knew this. They described the connections in their terms. They warned about the consequences of disturbing them. And the science, again, is confirming that they were right to warn. The pattern is extraordinary in its consistency. Across water systems, geological features, biological habitats, subsurface voids, geomagnetic anomalies, submarine springs, and tidal cave systems, the knowledge of the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley is proving to be accurate, not approximately, not in a general sense, specifically and in detail. This is the most important scientific finding about the Kimberley of the last 50 years. More important, in terms of what it means for how we understand this landscape and how we manage it, than any individual geological or hydrological discovery. Because it tells us that there is a body of knowledge about this landscape that is comprehensive, accurate, and available, and that we have been largely ignoring it. We cannot continue to ignore it. The pressures on the Kimberley are too great, and the consequences of getting the management of this landscape wrong are too serious. The water in the aquifers is not renewable on any human timescale. The species in the deep caves are not recoverable if they are lost. The geological systems are not repairable if they are damaged by extraction or development that does not account for their real structure and their real connections. The knowledge that tells us about the real structure and the real connections is the knowledge of the elders. And the science that is confirming that knowledge is telling us, as clearly as science can tell us anything, that we need to listen to it. This is the message of the Kimberley Underground. Not just a scientific message, a human message. A message about what it means to know a place. About what is possible when human beings commit themselves, over the longest possible timescales, to understanding the world they inhabit. About what we owe to those who have made that commitment. And about what we risk if we fail to honor it. The boreholes go down, the ancient water comes up, the elders know. And the country, patient and ancient and endlessly deep, holds the rest of what we need to know, waiting for us to ask the right questions in the right way of the right people. The warnings have been given. For 50,000 years, they have been given. The scientists have looked, and what they have found is that the warnings were right. Now the question is ours to answer. What do we do with this knowledge? What kind of people will we choose to be? The Kimberley is watching. and it has been patient for a very long time. But the patience of the rock, and the patience of the water, and the patience of the knowledge tradition that has been maintained here for 50,000 years is not infinite. The pressures on this landscape are real, and they are present, and they are increasing. And the time to incorporate the knowledge of the elders into the decisions that will shape the Kimberley's future is not some abstract future moment. It is now. It is today. It is in the decisions being made by governments and mining companies and pastoral enterprises and conservation organizations right now, in this year, about the future of one of the oldest and most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. The elders are still here. The knowledge is still alive. The science is confirming more of it every field season. And the invitation to listen, the invitation that has been open for 50,000 years, is still open. The only question is whether we will accept it. For in the end, the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley is not just a geological story. It is not just an archaeological story or a hydrological story or a biological story. It is a human story. A story about what it means to pay attention to the world over the longest possible timescales. About what becomes possible when knowledge is treated as something sacred, something worth maintaining at all costs across all the disruptions and disasters of the long human journey. It is a story about what the world holds in its deepest places, and about who the people are who have always known what was there. About the gap between knowing and discovering, and about the long, patient waiting of the knowledge for the discovery to arrive. The scientists finally looked, and they found that the country remembers, that it has always remembered, that in the dark, in the deep, in the ancient water and the ancient rock and the cave formations that have been forming in the absence of any human witness for millions of years, the history of this place is preserved. The physical record of what happened here is preserved. The signatures of ancient climates and ancient events and ancient connections are preserved, waiting in the dark to be read by anyone with the instruments and the understanding to read them. And the knowledge of where to look, the knowledge of what is down there and why it matters and what it means, that knowledge is preserved too, not in the rock, in the people. In the minds and the hearts and the ceremonies and the songs of the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley, who have been carrying it carefully and faithfully for 50,000 years. The warnings were right. The knowledge was real. The country holds what the elders said it holds. And now, finally, the science knows it too. This is the story of the Kimberley Underground, the oldest story still being told, the longest warning ever given, the most patient waiting for confirmation that any knowledge tradition in human history has ever had to endure, and the most extraordinary vindication. Because when the boreholes went down and the surveys flew and the isotope analyses were done and the sediment cores were extracted and the cave biology was catalogued and the geophysical surveys were conducted, what they found was what was always there. What the elders always knew was there. What the country has been holding, in its deep places, in its ancient water and its ancient rock, for longer than the human mind can encompass. The ground beneath the Kimberley is not just ground. It is memory. It is knowledge. It is the living record of everything that has happened in this place since the world was young. And the people who have been here for 50,000 years have known how to read it, have been reading it, have been transmitting what they read, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that is the most extraordinary achievement of the human mind. The scientists came, they confirmed what was always known, and the story continues, as it will, as long as the rock endures, as long as the water flows, as long as the people maintain their relationship with the country that has shaped them and sustained them and challenged them and rewarded them for 50,000 years. The Kimberley is still here, the elders are still here, the knowledge is still alive, and the boreholes are still going down, deep into the most ancient country on Earth, deep into the memory of the oldest knowledge tradition in human history, deep into the truth that was always there, waiting, patient as the rock, certain as the water, enduring as the people who kept it alive through everything the world could throw at them. The warning was right. The knowledge was real. The country remembers. And now, at long last, so do we. To understand the full weight of what is happening in the Kimberley, you need to understand something about the way that scientific discovery usually works. In most fields, discovery moves from the unknown to the known. A researcher identifies a question that has not been answered, designs an experiment or a survey to gather data about it, analyzes the data, and reports the findings. The process moves from ignorance toward knowledge, from darkness toward light. What is happening in the Kimberley is different. The knowledge was already there. The light was already on, in a sense. What the scientific process is doing is not illuminating what was dark. It is confirming what was already illuminated, moving from knowledge that existed in one tradition to knowledge that is now recognized by another. The discovery is not of something new. It is of something old that the discoverers were not previously aware of. This is a fundamentally different kind of scientific experience, and it is one that scientists who have had it describe as profoundly reorienting, because it forces you to ask not just what have we found, but what does it mean that we did not know this before? What does it say about the limits of our tradition's understanding? That a knowledge system we had largely dismissed as folklore or mythology turns out to contain accurate empirical information about the deep structure of the earth? These are uncomfortable questions. They are questions that point to failures of the scientific tradition as it has operated in colonial contexts. Failures of openness, failures of humility, failures of genuine curiosity about knowledge systems that do not look like what Western scientists were trained to recognize as knowledge. The Australian scientific community has been grappling with these failures for several decades now, and the grappling has produced important changes in how research is conducted in collaboration with Aboriginal communities, in how traditional knowledge is recognized in environmental assessment processes, and in how university curricula treat the question of Indigenous knowledge systems. But the changes have been slow, and the urgency is real, because the knowledge holders are aging. The languages in which traditional knowledge is most precisely expressed are, many of them, critically endangered. The communities that maintain the knowledge traditions of the Kimberley are facing the same pressures that Indigenous communities face everywhere. The pull of young people toward urban centers, the disruption of ceremonial and cultural life by the demands of the broader economy, the damage done by decades of government policies that systematically undermine the transmission of traditional knowledge from one generation to the next. The knowledge that the elders of the Kimberley hold is not automatically transmitted to the next generation. It has to be deliberately taught, in the appropriate contexts, through the appropriate processes, by people with the time and the energy and the cultural authority to teach it. And those conditions are not always present. Not as consistently as they once were. Not when the demands of the contemporary world compete for the time and attention of the people who would otherwise be learning. This is why the documentation work matters. The collaborative research projects that are recording traditional knowledge about the Kimberley Underground serve not just the scientific purpose of confirming what the knowledge says, they serve the cultural purpose of creating additional records of the knowledge, records that can exist alongside the living tradition, that can be accessible to future generations of custodians who might need to recover knowledge that was not fully transmitted in the disrupted conditions of recent decades. This is not a replacement for living transmission. A database entry is not the same as knowledge held in the mind of a custodian who has been taught it in the appropriate ceremonial context. But it is better than loss. And in the current situation, where the conditions for ideal transmission have been so severely compromised by historical and ongoing disruptions, documentation is part of a strategy for knowledge survival that the communities themselves are developing. The scientists who participate in this work understand that they are not just gathering data for their own publications. They are participating in a process of knowledge preservation that has significance far beyond any individual research project. They are contributing to the survival of a knowledge tradition that is, by any measure, irreplaceable. A knowledge tradition that contains, among many other things, accurate empirical information about one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. The responsibility of this participation is something that the researchers who take it seriously feel acutely. The knowledge belongs to the custodians. The research is done at their invitation, on their terms, for purposes that include but are not limited to the scientific. The publication of findings must be done in ways that protect knowledge that is not to be made public. The relationships must be maintained with integrity across field seasons and across the long periods between field seasons when the researchers are in their universities and the custodians are in their country. All of this is harder than simply going somewhere, taking samples, and publishing the results, but it is the only way to do this work properly. And the results, when it is done properly, are better, more accurate, more contextually grounded, more reflective of the actual complexity of what is being studied. The best science about the Kimberley is being done in genuine partnership with the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley. This is not despite the constraints that partnership imposes. It is partly because of them. Now we need to talk about the minerals. About the extraordinary geological richness of the Kimberley underground, and about the tension between the value of what is down there and the knowledge of what is at stake if it is extracted without proper understanding of the systems within which it exists. The Kimberley contains some of the most significant mineral deposits in Australia. The Argyle Diamond Mine, which operated for more than 3 decades before its closure in 2020, was the world's largest producer of diamonds by volume and the source of almost all of the world's rare pink diamonds, gems of such extraordinary color and rarity that some individual stones have sold for more than $1 million per carat. The mine was embedded in a volcanic pipe, a kimberlite intrusion that had punched up through the ancient basement rock of the Kimberley billions of years ago, carrying with it diamonds that formed under the immense pressures of the mantle far below. The region also contains significant deposits of iron ore, bauxite, gold, zinc, lead, and a range of other minerals. The Ord River area, in the eastern Kimberley, has been developed for large-scale irrigated agriculture using water from the Ord River scheme, a major dam and irrigation infrastructure that has fundamentally altered the hydrology of a large part of the eastern Kimberley. These developments have not been without controversy. The Argyle mine was located in country belonging to the Miriuwung, Gija, and Malngin peoples, and its development was strongly opposed by some members of those communities. The Ord River scheme flooded vast areas of land that were significant to the Miriuwung and Gajarong peoples, including cultural sites and resource areas that had been used for thousands of years. The consultation and compensation processes associated with these projects were, by general acknowledgement, inadequate. The traditional knowledge about the underground of these areas was not properly engaged, and the consequences of that failure are still being lived by the communities whose country was transformed without adequate understanding of what was being destroyed. The lesson of these developments, a lesson that the Aboriginal custodians of the affected areas had been trying to convey for years before the developments proceeded, is that the underground of the Kimberley cannot be treated as a resource to be extracted in isolation from the systems within which it exists. The diamonds in the kimberlite pipe were part of a geological system that extended far beyond the boundaries of the mine lease. The water that was impounded by the Ord River Dam was part of a hydrological system that reached underground to parts of the Kimberley that the dam planners had not fully considered. The knowledge of these connections, the knowledge that the Aboriginal custodians held and tried to share, was the knowledge that could have prevented some of the damage, but it was not listened to. Now, in a new generation of proposed developments in the Kimberley, there are opportunities to do things differently. The environmental impact assessment processes are more rigorous than they were in the decades when the Argyle Mine and the Ord River scheme were being planned. The legal rights of Aboriginal traditional owners to be consulted and to participate in decision-making about their country are more strongly established than they were. The scientific understanding of the importance of traditional knowledge is more developed, and the communities themselves are more organized, more legally empowered, and more determined to ensure that what happened to the Argyle country and the Ord River Valley does not happen again to other parts of their country. But the pressures have not diminished. If anything, they have intensified. The demand for the resources that lie beneath the Kimberley continues to grow. The water in the aquifers is increasingly seen as a strategic resource in a world where water scarcity is becoming a defining challenge. The minerals in the ancient rock are increasingly valued in a world that is transitioning rapidly to new technologies that require specific raw materials. The land itself is increasingly valued for the carbon that its extensive but largely undisturbed vegetation holds. Against these pressures, the knowledge of the Aboriginal custodians, the knowledge of what is down there and what it means and what happens when it is disturbed, is not just culturally significant. It is strategically essential. It is the knowledge base that any serious and responsible management of this landscape must build on. The scientific work of the last few decades has made this clearer than it has ever been. The confirmation of traditional knowledge about underground water systems, cave systems, geological connections, biological habitats, and geological hazards has demonstrated, with increasing rigor and increasing specificity, that the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley know things about this landscape that no one else knows, and that those things matter for how the landscape is managed. This is not a claim that everything proposed for the Kimberley should be refused because the traditional custodians say it should be refused. It is a claim that no significant decision about the Kimberley's future should be made without properly understanding and properly incorporating the knowledge that the traditional custodians hold. That the default position should be to listen first, to ask what the knowledge says about the system being affected, to check the scientific evidence against the traditional knowledge, to let the convergence between them guide the decision. This is not idealism. It is pragmatism informed by the evidence. The evidence shows that the traditional knowledge is accurate, that it contains information about underground systems and connections that matter for predicting the consequences of development, that ignoring it leads to mistakes that are, in some cases, irreversible, and that incorporating it leads to better decisions, better outcomes, and a better relationship between the scientific and cultural understanding of this extraordinary landscape. The Kimberley is not just a resource, it is a story, the longest, deepest, most complex story about any landscape on Earth. A story that has been being told for 50,000 years by the people who know it best, and that story is not over. It is still being told, by the elders who hold the knowledge, by the scientists who are beginning to confirm it, by the country itself, in the language of its water and its rock and its ancient, patient underground. Listen to the story. That is what the evidence says. That is what 50,000 years of accurate knowledge demands. That is what the boreholes and the surveys, and the isotope analyses, and the cave biologies, and all the instruments of modern science are telling us, as clearly as they can tell us anything. Listen to the elders, look where they point, and understand that what lies beneath the Kimberley is not just rock and water and mineral wealth, it is knowledge. The oldest knowledge in the world. The most accurate and most comprehensive knowledge about one of the oldest and most complex landscapes on Earth. And the people who hold it are still here, still willing to share what can appropriately be shared, still waiting, patient as they have always been patient, for the world outside their country to understand what they have always known. The warning has been given for 50,000 years. The scientists have finally looked, and now it is time to act on what we know. Every landscape has a story. The story of the Kimberley is the longest one, the deepest one, the one that goes furthest back into the time before human memory, that reaches furthest down into the rock, that extends furthest forward into the future that we are collectively responsible for creating. To be in the Kimberley, to stand on its ancient rock and look out over its gorges and its rivers and its vast, heat-shimmering plateau country, is to understand something about time that is difficult to understand anywhere else on Earth. You feel the weight of it, the depth of it, the incomprehensible span of geological and human time that has accumulated in this place, and that is, in some sense, still present, not as history, as country, as the living ground beneath your feet. The people who feel this most profoundly are the people who have always been here. The custodians who have grown up in this country, who have been taught by their parents and their grandparents to read it, to feel it, to understand it in the full range of ways that 50,000 years of intimate relationship makes possible. They stand on the same rock you stand on. They look out over the same gorges, but they see something different. They see the connections that are invisible to the eye but real to the knowledge. They see the underground that is hidden from the surface but present in the dreaming. They see the deep time not as an abstraction but as a living reality that shapes how this country works today and how it will work tomorrow. Their knowledge of what lies beneath is the oldest and deepest knowledge of this place that exists, and it is real. The science has confirmed this, discovery by discovery, field season by field season, borehole by borehole. The warnings were accurate. The knowledge was right. Now the question is ours. What we do with this knowledge. What kind of future we build for the Kimberley. What kind of people we choose to be in relation to the oldest and deepest knowledge tradition on Earth. The elders have warned. The scientists have confirmed. The country is waiting for the response. This is the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley. The longest warning ever given, the most patient vindication in human history. The most extraordinary convergence of ancient knowledge and modern science that any landscape on Earth has yet produced. And it is still unfolding, still being written, borehole by borehole, confirmation by confirmation, discovery by discovery, in the collaboration between the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and the youngest major scientific tradition in Australian history. The country is deep, the knowledge is deep, the time is deep, and the story continues. The rock beneath the Kimberley is 3 billion years old. The water in its deepest aquifers is 40,000 years old. The knowledge of what is down there is 50,000 years old. And the confirmation of that knowledge, the scientific record that is now documenting what the elders always knew, is being written in real time by researchers who come to this country with their instruments and their methods and their peer review processes, and who find again and again that the knowledge that was already here is more comprehensive, more accurate, and more astonishing than anything they had expected to find. This is the gift of the Kimberley to the world. Not its diamonds, though they were extraordinary, not its water, though it is precious, not its mineral wealth, though it is significant. Its gift to the world is the demonstration of what human knowledge can be, at its best, at its deepest, at its most sustained and its most committed. The demonstration that it is possible to know a place, truly know it, in its full depth and complexity, if you are willing to pay the attention and take the time and maintain the commitment that genuine knowing requires. The Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley have paid that attention. They have taken that time. They have maintained that commitment across 50,000 years of unbroken relationship with this country. And what they have produced is the most comprehensive and the most accurate body of knowledge about any landscape on Earth. The scientists are confirming it, the instruments are catching up, and the story is being told, finally, in a way that the world outside the Kimberley is beginning to hear. The warning was right. The knowledge was real. The country remembers. And now, at long last, we are beginning to remember with it. Deep beneath the Kimberley, in the dark and the silence and the patience of ancient rock and ancient water, the country holds what it has always held. The memory of everything that has happened here, the record of everything that was, the truth of everything that is. The boreholes went down, the truth came up, and it was exactly what the elders said it would be. It was always there. They always knew. There is a river in the Kimberley that the Ngarrindjin people call by a name that translates roughly as the river that goes two ways. It is a description that non-Aboriginal visitors to the area have often found puzzling, because from the surface, the river appears to flow in one direction only, as rivers generally do. It flows toward the coast, as gravity demands, and there is nothing in its surface appearance to suggest that anything more complex is happening. But the Ngarrindjin know what is happening beneath the surface. They know that in certain conditions, at certain times of the year, in certain stretches of the river channel, the water is doing something that has no surface expression, but that is, in hydrological terms, real and significant. Beneath the riverbed, in the alluvial sands and gravels that line the channel, water is moving in a direction that is different from the surface flow. Bank storage and release, hydrologists call it. The movement of water into and out of the porous material beneath and beside a river channel in response to changes in the river's flow regime. The Ngarrindjin do not call it bank storage and release. They call it the river that goes two ways. The description captures the essential reality of what is happening, which is that the water in this system is not all moving in the same direction at the same time, that the relationship between the river and the underground is dynamic and bidirectional. Water flows from the river into the bank, Water flows from the bank back into the river. The system breathes, in a sense. It exchanges water between the surface and the underground in a rhythm that responds to rainfall and drought and the seasonal patterns of flow. This knowledge is not trivial. Understanding bank storage and release is important for predicting how a river system will respond to changes in flow regime. It is important for understanding the relationship between surface water and groundwater in alluvial systems. It is important for managing water resources in ways that maintain the ecological function of the river and its associated groundwater systems. And it is knowledge that the Aboriginal have had for as long as they have been on this river, encoded in the name they gave to this particular stretch of water. When hydrologists began studying the river and found evidence of the bank storage dynamics that the Aboriginal name describes, there was a moment of recognition, not of something new, but of something already known expressed in a different language. The Aboriginal had been describing this hydrological process for as long as anyone can remember, in a name that encodes the observation accurately and precisely. This is, in miniature, the story of the entire Kimberley underground. The Aboriginal peoples of this region have been describing features of the underground in their own terms for 50,000 years. The scientists arrive with their instruments and find that the descriptions are accurate. The knowledge transfers, the understanding deepens, and the country, patient as it always is slightly better known. One of the most striking aspects of the traditional knowledge about the Kimberley underground is its geographical specificity. It is not general knowledge about underground systems in a vague sense. It is knowledge about specific features at specific locations. It names places. It describes the character of specific sites. It gives directions. It provides information about how to get from one known location to another, underground, through a landscape that is invisible to the eye. This specificity is what makes the traditional knowledge most scientifically valuable and most scientifically testable. When an elder says that there is a connection between this site and that site underground, that can be checked. When a story describes a specific chamber in a cave system, with specific features, at a specific depth, and in a specific direction from the entrance, that can be verified. When the dreaming knowledge says that the water at this inland spring carries the quality of the deep country, that can be tested with isotope analysis. And when these specific claims are checked, when the predictions of the traditional knowledge are tested against the measurements of the instruments, the degree of accuracy is, in most cases, extraordinary. Not perfect, not without exceptions or inconsistencies, but far more accurate than any alternative explanation could account for. The alternative explanations have been considered. Are the stories simply guesses that happen to be right? The probability against this scales with the number of independent predictions that are confirmed. Are the custodians describing things they learned from early European surveyors? The survey records do not support this in most cases, and the knowledge predates the European presence in the region by tens of thousands of years. Are the stories the result of recent access to scientific information? In some cases, this might apply to specific details, but the core geographical information predates any scientific survey of the region. The most parsimonious explanation for the accuracy of the traditional knowledge about the Kimberley underground is that it derives from what it claims to derive from: generations of careful observation of this landscape, encoded and transmitted with extraordinary fidelity across 50,000 years. This explanation requires accepting something that the scientific tradition has been slow to accept: that a knowledge system that does not use writing, that does not use instruments, that does not follow the processes of peer review and publication, can nonetheless produce and maintain accurate empirical knowledge about complex natural systems over timescales that dwarf the history of any institution that does use those things. The Kimberley evidence requires this acceptance. The data demands it. And the scientific researchers who have worked most closely with the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley are, for the most part, willing to accept it, because they have seen the evidence. They have been present for the moments of confirmation. They have asked the questions and gotten the answers and then gone out with their instruments and found that the answers were right. This is a significant intellectual shift. It is not comfortable for a tradition that has, for several centuries, operated on the assumption that it has a monopoly on reliable empirical knowledge. but it is a shift that the evidence demands and that an honest engagement with the evidence requires. The Kimberley is not asking the scientific tradition to abandon its methods. It is asking it to expand its understanding of what counts as knowledge, to recognize that the accumulated empirical observations of 50,000 years, encoded and transmitted through cultural practices developed specifically for this purpose, constitute a body of knowledge that deserves the same respect and the same serious engagement as any peer-reviewed paper or doctoral dissertation, not instead of those things. Alongside them, this is what genuine intellectual humility looks like. Not the abandonment of critical thinking or the acceptance of everything claimed in the name of traditional knowledge, but the willingness to test claims, to follow the evidence where it leads, and to acknowledge that the evidence, in the case of the Kimberley, leads to a conclusion that challenges some fundamental assumptions of the scientific tradition. The conclusion is this: the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley know what is beneath their country. They have known it for 50,000 years. And the science that has been applied to the Kimberley in recent decades is confirming this knowledge, detail by detail, site by site, borehole by borehole. This is one of the most extraordinary facts about the world that the 21st century has produced, and it is a fact that the Kimberley itself has been producing, quietly, in the dark, in the rock and the water and the deep memory of an ancient country, for as long as there have been people here to pay attention to it. The elders warned about what was beneath the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and the knowledge that the country held in trust for 50,000 years has proven to be accurate, specific, extraordinary, and true. This story is not over. The Kimberley is too old, too deep, too complex, and too little understood for its story to be over. The boreholes will keep going down, the surveys will keep flying. The collaborations between elders and scientists will keep producing new confirmations of what was always known, and the knowledge will keep being shared, carefully and appropriately, on the terms set by the people who hold it, for the purposes that the country requires. Not as a performance for the scientific or cultural curiosity of outsiders, as a living engagement with a living landscape that has been cared for and understood by the same people for longer than any other landscape on Earth. The deep time of the rock, the deep time of the water, the deep time of the knowledge, all of it present in the ancient country of the Kimberley, all of it real, all of it waiting, patient as it has always been, for us to finally pay the kind of attention it deserves. The Kimberley has been patient for 3 billion years, for 50,000 years, for the decades and centuries since the scientific tradition arrived here with its instruments and its assumptions. It will be patient for as long as it takes. But the knowledge is here. The elders are here. The evidence is mounting. And the time to listen is not in some abstract future. It is now. It is today. It is in every decision being made about this landscape, and in every conversation between a scientist with a borehole and an elder with a story, and in every moment when the instruments confirm what was always known. The warning was right. The knowledge is real, the country remembers, and now, finally, so do we. In the still heart of the Kimberley, in the places where the gorges are deepest and the rock is most ancient and the silence is most complete, there is something that you can feel but cannot quite name. Something that every person who has spent real time in this country describes in different words, but that seems to point toward the same experience. A sense of being watched. Not in a threatening sense, in the sense of being in the presence of something very old that is paying close attention. Something that has been here much longer than you have, that knows this place in ways you cannot fully comprehend, and that is neither hostile nor indifferent, but simply and profoundly present. The Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley have a name for what you are feeling. They have a framework for understanding it that encompasses both the spiritual and the practical dimensions of the experience. They understand it as the country itself. The living, attending presence of a landscape that is not inert matter, but a participant in the relationships that sustain it. To the Western scientific tradition, this is not the kind of language that belongs in an empirical discussion of geology and hydrology and underground cave systems. And in a strictly technical sense, that is probably right. The rocks are rocks. The water is water. The underground is a physical system governed by physical laws. But the experience of being in the Kimberley, the experience of standing in one of the world's most ancient landscapes and feeling its weight and its age and its complex, layered presence does not feel like a purely technical experience. It feels like an encounter with something that is there in a way that is more than purely material. Something that the Aboriginal custodians of this place have been in relationship with for 50,000 years, and that has shaped who they are as profoundly as they have shaped their relationship with it. This is not mysticism, or not only mysticism, it is an acknowledgement of something that the science itself is beginning to articulate, that the most ancient and most stable landscapes on Earth have properties that are genuinely extraordinary. Properties that emerge from their antiquity and their complexity and the depth of the time they have been accumulating. Properties that make them different, in important ways, from younger and less complex landscapes. The Kimberley is different. Its rock is different. Its water is different. Its underground is different. It has been here, doing what it does, for longer than life on land has existed. And the knowledge of what it is doing, the knowledge of its underground and its connections and its rhythms and its hazards, is knowledge that required the full depth of 50,000 years of human attention to accumulate. The elders hold that knowledge. The science is confirming it. And the country is, as it always has been, present. Real, ancient, extraordinary, patient enough to wait for the world to catch up to what it has always been trying to show us. The boreholes go down. The ancient water comes up, the country remembers, and now, at last, the story is beginning to be heard. Not just in Australia, not just in the scientific community, but in the wider world, where the extraordinary nature of what the Kimberley represents and what the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley have preserved is beginning to be understood. The oldest continuous culture on Earth, the oldest knowledge tradition in human history, the most comprehensive and the most accurate body of knowledge about any specific landscape that any human community has ever produced. All of it in the Kimberley, all of it alive, all of it still being maintained and still being shared, carefully and appropriately by the people whose country it is and whose knowledge it has always been. The warning has been given for 50,000 years. The scientists have finally looked, and the truth that was always beneath the Kimberley, the truth that the country has been holding in its rock and its water and its deep, ancient patience, has finally been confirmed. It was always there. They always knew. And now the world knows too. In the years that the scientific collaboration in the Kimberley has been deepening, there have been individual moments that stand out. Moments that the researchers who were present describe as turning points, not just in their research but in their understanding of what knowledge is and what it can be. One such moment happened in a gorge in the northern Kimberley, at a location that will not be named here because it remains a site of cultural sensitivity. A team of researchers had been working with a small group of custodians to document traditional knowledge about the hydrology of a particular river system. They had been walking the river for 3 days, and the elder who was guiding them had been describing the underground connections along the way, pointing out sites where he said the underground water was close to the surface, sites where he said the river connected to aquifer systems that extended far beyond the visible catchment, sites where he said the water went down and came back up in a way that the surface alone could not show. On the 3rd day, they came to a particular stretch of the gorge where the river ran between walls of ancient sandstone. The elder stopped walking. He stood for a moment looking at the cliff face on one side of the gorge. Then he said something to one of the Aboriginal field workers who was translating, and the field worker told the researchers to look at the cliff. There was nothing obviously remarkable about the cliff. It was the same ancient red sandstone that lined every gorge in this part of the country. It rose about 40 meters above the river, its surface textured by millions of years of erosion, covered in places by the dark biological crust of algae and lichen that colonizes desert rock in humid conditions. The elder said that inside the cliff, at a depth he indicated with a gesture, there was water. Not water that had seeped in through the surface, water that had been there since before the gorge was cut. Water that was connected to a system that ran beneath the whole plateau, Water that the dreaming tracks described as the water of the deep country, the water that had been there since before the world was as it now is. One of the researchers made a note. 3 months later, a hydrogeologist with a portable ground-penetrating radar unit came back to the same site. He ran the instrument along the base of the cliff, and at the depth that the elder had indicated, there was an anomaly in the radar return, an anomaly consistent with the presence of a water-saturated zone in the rock. Water. Inside the cliff, exactly where the elder said. The hydrogeologist spent several hours at the site. He ran the radar in multiple directions. He took readings at multiple points along the cliff face. The anomaly was consistent and clear. There was water in the cliff, not in a crack that was visible from the surface. In the rock itself, in the pore spaces of the ancient sandstone, at the depth, the elder had said. He could not, from the ground-penetrating radar alone, determine how much water was there, or whether it was connected to a broader system in the way the elder had described. More investigation would be needed to answer those questions. But the water was there, and the elder had known it was there. When the hydrogeologist called the lead researcher to report what the radar had found, the lead researcher later described the phone call as one of the most significant moments in her career. Not because of what the radar had found, taken in isolation, but because of what it meant in the context of everything else the team had been documenting. Another piece of the picture, another confirmation, another moment in which the knowledge that was always there was confirmed by the instruments that were new. Moments like this one are multiplying. As more researchers engage with Aboriginal traditional knowledge in the Kimberley with genuine curiosity and genuine rigor, as the instruments become more sensitive and the surveys become more comprehensive and the boreholes go deeper, the confirmations accumulate. The picture becomes clearer, the case becomes stronger, and the picture that is emerging is one of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary coherence, a landscape in which the surface and the underground are deeply connected, in which the patterns of water movement and geological connection extend across distances and depths that the standard hydrological models were not designed to capture, in which the biological systems of the underground are as rich and as diverse and as ecologically significant as the biological systems of the surface, in which the knowledge of all of this, held by the Aboriginal custodians in a tradition 50,000 years old, is more comprehensive and more accurate than anything that modern science has so far produced independently. This is not a comfortable picture for a scientific tradition that has spent several centuries positioning itself as the primary source of reliable knowledge about the natural world. It is a picture that requires humility. That requires acknowledging that the tradition has been operating in the Kimberley for a few decades, looking at a landscape that has been known for 50,000 years, and that the difference between those timescales is not a minor consideration. It is the central fact of the knowledge situation in this place. The humility is coming, slowly, unevenly, against the resistance of habits of mind that are deeply embedded in the training and the culture of the scientific tradition. But it is coming, because the evidence requires it, because the data accumulates, because the boreholes keep going down and the water that comes up is exactly what the elders said it would be. And with the humility comes something else, a kind of wonder, a deepening appreciation for what the human mind and the human community can achieve when they are applied with sustained commitment and genuine skill over the longest possible timescales to the most fundamental of all human challenges. Understanding the world we inhabit. The Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley have achieved something extraordinary. They have built and maintained a knowledge system about one of the most complex landscapes on Earth that has remained accurate and comprehensive for 50,000 years. They have done this without writing, without instruments, without the institutions and the processes that the Western scientific tradition has developed to produce and protect knowledge. They have done it through the development of a cultural technology, the dreaming tradition, that is, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated knowledge management systems that any human community has ever developed. The appreciation of this achievement is growing in the scientific community. It is growing in the broader Australian public. It is growing internationally. as the research findings from the Kimberley reach audiences that understand their implications for the global conversation about Indigenous knowledge and its relationship to Western science. The Kimberley is, in this sense, a gift, not a gift that was given lightly or without conditions, or to anyone who happened to ask. A gift that has been carefully protected, and that is being shared appropriately and on the terms of the custodians, with a world that is only beginning to understand what it represents. The gift is knowledge, the oldest, deepest, most carefully maintained knowledge about any landscape on Earth, knowledge of the underground, knowledge of the connections, knowledge of the hazards and the opportunities and the rhythms and the patterns of a country that has been inhabited by the same people for longer than any other landscape in the world. This knowledge is being confirmed by science. It is being documented in research publications and government reports and university theses. It is being incorporated slowly and imperfectly into the management frameworks for one of Australia's most extraordinary natural landscapes. And it is still being held, most importantly, in the minds and the hearts and the ceremonies and the songs of the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley, who have been its stewards for 50,000 years and who will, if the world has the wisdom to support them appropriately, be its stewards for 50,000 more. The elders warned about what was beneath the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and the world, slowly and perhaps not yet fully, is beginning to understand what was found. Not just underground water, not just cave systems and geological anomalies in ancient biological communities, not just the confirmation of specific geographical claims about specific underground features in a specific remote landscape. What was found is the truth of something that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia have been saying about themselves and about their knowledge for as long as Europeans have been present to hear it. That they know this country, that the knowledge they hold about it is real and accurate and comprehensive. That the time they have been here and the attention they have paid to this landscape have produced a body of understanding that deserves the deepest respect and the most serious engagement. The boreholes confirm it. The surveys confirm it. The isotope analyses and the cave biologies and the geophysical surveys and the hydrological models all, in their different ways, confirm it. And the country itself, the ancient, patient, extraordinary country of the Kimberley, has always known it, has been holding it, in the dark of its deep underground, in the memory of its ancient water, in the silence of its caves that have not seen light for millions of years. The country knows. The elders know. And now, finally, after all the long patience of 50,000 years, the instruments know too. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next chapter. The chapter in which what has been confirmed is acted upon, in which the knowledge of the elders is incorporated not just into scientific papers, but into the decisions that will shape the future of the Kimberley, in which the warnings that have been given for 50,000 years are finally heeded by the people with the power to heed them. That chapter is not yet written, but the evidence that should inform it is now clear. The warning was right. The knowledge is real. The country remembers. And now, at last, we are listening. In the dark, beneath the ancient red rock of the Kimberley, the water that fell as rain 40,000 years ago moves slowly through fractures in the stone. It carries with it the chemical memory of a climate that no longer exists, the temperature of a world that was different, the dissolved minerals of rock that has been dissolving for millions of years in the deep dark, where no light has ever reached. Somewhere above it, on the ancient surface that it will never see, an elder sits with a young person and begins a story. The story is about this water, about where it is, and where it came from, and what it means, and why it matters, and what happens when it is disturbed. The story has been told in this country for 50,000 years. Each telling is a link in a chain that stretches back to the beginning of human life on this continent and forward into a future that the story is helping to protect. The instruments of modern science are, somewhere nearby, measuring things about this same water, taking readings, recording data, analyzing samples. The researchers operating them are doing careful, rigorous work that will eventually produce papers and reports and a growing body of scientific knowledge about the deep hydrology of the Kimberley. And the findings of the instruments are confirming what the story says. This is the world that the Kimberley has made possible. A world in which the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and the youngest major scientific tradition on Earth are beginning to talk to each other, beginning to recognize, across all the differences of language and method and epistemology, that they are describing the same thing, that the water is where the story says it is, that the connections are where the dreaming tracks describe them, that what lies beneath is what the elders have always said was there. The conversation is just beginning, the understanding is just deepening. The work is just starting to produce the results that will, over the coming decades, transform our knowledge of this landscape and our understanding of what human knowledge can be. But the foundation is solid, the evidence is clear, and the direction is set. Listen to the elders, look where they point, and understand that what they are pointing to is real. It was always real. It was always there. They always knew. And now, finally, so do we. The Kimberley is waiting, patient as it has always been, patient as the oldest rock on Earth, patient as water that has been sitting in the dark for 40,000 years, patient and full of knowledge, full of the knowledge that the elders have been holding for 50,000 years, full of the truth that the instruments are beginning to confirm, full of the story of what lies beneath, the story that the elders have been telling for as long as there have been people here to tell it, the story that the scientists are finally beginning to hear, the story that the country has always known, the story that is, at last, beginning to be told in a language that the world outside the Kimberley can understand. The warning was right. The knowledge was real, and the country, patient and ancient and endlessly deep, is still here, still holding what it has always held, still waiting for us to understand, still telling the story, still and always. And deep, to sit with the knowledge that the Aboriginal elders of the Kimberley hold about what lies beneath their country is to understand something about the nature of time that most modern people rarely encounter. It is not the time of calendars and clocks and the relentless forward press of schedules and deadlines. It is the time of the rock, the time of the water, the time of a knowledge tradition that has been moving forward, slowly and with extraordinary fidelity, for 50,000 years. When an elder describes what lies beneath a particular site, they are drawing on something that is not just their personal knowledge. They are drawing on the accumulated observations of every generation of custodians who has held this country before them. They are drawing on the stories their parents told them, and their grandparents told their parents, and their great-grandparents told theirs, in an unbroken chain that reaches back to the first people who walked into the Kimberley and began learning what was there. Every generation tested the knowledge against the reality of the landscape. Every generation added new observations, refined the understanding, corrected errors, incorporated new information. And every generation passed the result forward, encoded in stories and songs and ceremonies, and the physical practice of walking through the country in ways that activated and reinforced the geographical knowledge embedded in the tradition. 50,000 years of this process produces something that no other method of knowledge generation can replicate. Not because the individual observations are more accurate, or because the recording technology is superior, but because the time itself is incomparable. Because the knowledge that emerges from 50,000 years of sustained, systematic observation of a specific landscape is inherently more comprehensive, more contextually grounded, and more sensitive to long-term patterns and processes than any knowledge tradition that has been operating in the same landscape for a few decades or a few centuries. This is the gift. This is what the Kimberley offers to the world. Not just the specific knowledge of its underground, as extraordinary as that knowledge is, but the demonstration of what becomes possible when a human community commits to knowing a place over the longest possible timescales. When the relationship between a people and their landscape is sustained with the kind of depth and commitment that 50,000 years of continuous habitation represents. The demonstration matters beyond the Kimberley. It matters for how we think about knowledge in general, about what kinds of knowledge are possible, and through what means, and over what timescales. About the relationship between different knowledge traditions and the landscapes they describe, about the ways in which the knowledge held by Indigenous peoples around the world might contain information about those landscapes that the methods of Western science have not yet accessed. The Kimberley is the most extreme example, the most documented, the most clearly confirmed. But it is not unique. Across the world, there are Indigenous knowledge traditions that have been accumulating empirical observations about specific landscapes for extended periods. Traditions that contain geographical information, ecological information, hydrological information, geological information, that the standard scientific surveys of those landscapes have not yet confirmed or have not yet thought to look for. The Kimberley case is a demonstration that looking for these things is worthwhile, that the investment of time and resources in genuinely collaborative research with Indigenous knowledge holders pays returns in scientific understanding that are not available through any other means. That the confirmation of Indigenous knowledge about underground systems, ecological relationships, and long-term environmental change is not just culturally respectful, it is scientifically essential. This is the practical implication of the story of the Kimberley Underground. Not just that we should protect the rights and the knowledge of the Aboriginal custodians of this specific landscape, though we should, but that the approach to knowledge that the Kimberley case exemplifies, the genuine collaboration between Indigenous traditional knowledge and Western scientific methods, should become the standard approach to research in Indigenous landscapes around the world, because the knowledge is there. In many places, accumulated over many generations by the people who have been paying attention for the longest time, waiting to be engaged with, on appropriate terms, with appropriate respect, for purposes that serve both the scientific understanding and the well-being of the communities who hold it. The Kimberley has shown what this looks like at its best. What happens when the dialogue is genuine? When the scientists bring their instruments and their rigor and their capacity to test and document and publish? When the custodians bring their knowledge and their relationships with country and their 50,000-year depth of observation? When the two meet in a spirit of mutual respect and genuine curiosity? When both sides are willing to be surprised by what they find? What they find in the Kimberley is extraordinary. Borehole after borehole, survey after survey, field season after field season, the picture of what lies beneath this ancient country deepens and clarifies. And the picture that emerges is, every time, more complex and more interconnected and more astonishing than the picture that preceded it. The water is older and more widely connected than the models predicted. The caves are more extensive and more biologically rich than anyone outside the Aboriginal tradition expected. The geological connections are more complex and more consequential for the surface landscape than the surveys had suggested. The knowledge of the elders is more specific, more accurate, and more comprehensive than the scientific community had been prepared to acknowledge. And the lesson that the Kimberley is teaching the world is simple. The knowledge that has been accumulated here, over 50,000 years, by the people who have lived here and cared for this country with extraordinary commitment and extraordinary skill, is real. It is accurate. It is extraordinary. And it deserves the deepest respect and the most serious engagement. The elders warned about what was beneath the Kimberley for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and what they found was the truth. The truth that was always there. The truth that has been held in the country, in the dark and the deep and the ancient water, for longer than any other truth has been held anywhere in the world. The boreholes go down, the water comes up, the instruments confirm, the elders nod, and the country, patient as it has always been, patient as it will always be, holds what it has always held, waiting for us to understand, waiting for us to listen, waiting for us to be worthy of the knowledge that has been offered to us, for 50,000 years, by the people who have kept it alive through everything the world could throw at them, by the people who knew what was beneath the Kimberley, who always knew, who will always know. If we have the wisdom to listen, the country remembers. And when we listen, when we truly listen to the knowledge that has been maintained here for 50,000 years, we begin, in some small measure, to remember with it. The boreholes go down, the ancient water rises, the surveys confirm, the elders speak, and the deep, patient knowledge of the oldest country on earth moves, slowly and with extraordinary grace, from the deep underground, where it has always lived, into the light, where it has always been waiting, where it will always be waiting. For us, the knowledge of what lies beneath the Kimberley is 50,000 years old. The water is 40,000 years old. The rock is 3 billion years old. And the story that the elders have been telling and the scientists have been confirming and the country has been holding in its ancient underground silence, is just beginning to be heard. Just beginning to be told in the words that the world outside the Kimberley can understand. Just beginning to change the way we think about knowledge and time and what it means to know a place. Just beginning. In the deepest and most ancient country on earth, where the knowledge has always been, where it will always be, where the elders will always be telling the story, and where, now, the instruments are listening too. The warning was right. The knowledge is real. The country is waiting, and the story's not over. It is, in fact, just beginning. The most important beginning. In the most ancient place, with the oldest knowledge, and the deepest truth, the Kimberley, where the boreholes go down, and the truth comes up, as it always has, as it always will, in the patient, ancient, extraordinary underground of the world's oldest living knowledge tradition. Still here, still known, still waiting, still true. There are things in the Kimberley that have no name in English. Features of the landscape, relationships between places, qualities of light and silence, and ancient presence that the language of geology and hydrology and ecology can gesture toward but cannot fully capture. Things that the Aboriginal languages of the Kimberley name with a precision that reflects 50,000 years of experience with them. Things that you understand better after you have spent time in the country with someone who knows it than after you have spent time reading about it in a scientific paper. This is not a failure of science. Science is extraordinarily good at what it does, measuring, quantifying, modeling, predicting, and explaining the physical processes of the natural world. What it is less good at, what it was not designed to do, is conveying the quality of a landscape. The texture of deep time made present in red rock and ancient water. The specific character of a silence that has not been interrupted in 3 billion years. The way the gorges of the Kimberley look in the early morning light, when the shadows are still deep and the birds are just beginning to sound, and the country is in that moment between dark and full day that feels, in this place more than almost anywhere else on earth, like the moment at the beginning of things. The elders know this quality. They have language for it. They have ceremonies that enact it. They have stories that transmit the felt sense of what it is to be in relationship with a country this old and this deep and this known. And they have been transmitting that sense from generation to generation, as faithfully as they have transmitted the empirical information about underground water systems and geological hazards. Both kinds of knowledge, the empirical and what we might call the experiential or the relational, are real. Both are important. Both are part of what the custodians of the Kimberley hold in trust for this country and for the future. And both are, in their different ways, being confirmed and appreciated and incorporated into how the world outside the Kimberley is beginning to understand this place. The empirical knowledge is being confirmed by the instruments. The relational knowledge is being confirmed by the experience of the scientists and researchers and other outsiders who spend significant time in the Kimberley working in genuine partnership with the custodians, who come with their boreholes and their surveys and their peer review processes and find, over time, that the country is doing something to them that is not purely about data collection. That is changing how they understand their own relationship to the natural world. That is giving them something that their training did not give them and that their instruments cannot measure, but that is, nonetheless, real and important and worth having. The knowledge of the Kimberley is not just about what lies beneath the surface. It is about what it means to stand on the surface of a landscape this old. To be in relationship with a country that was ancient before the first human walked on it, and that has been known, with deepening intimacy, by the same people for 50,000 years. To understand, even partially, even approximately, what that relationship is and what it means. This is what the elders offer when they share their knowledge of the Kimberley underground. Not just information about specific geological features and hydrological connections and underground biological communities, but an invitation into a different relationship with the natural world. A relationship based on sustained attention and genuine curiosity and the willingness to know a place over the longest possible timescales. This is the invitation the Kimberley is extending to the world. Through the research findings and the collaborative projects and the growing recognition of traditional ecological knowledge as a legitimate and valuable form of empirical understanding, through the boreholes that confirm what the elders knew and the surveys that map what the dreaming tracks describe and the isotope analyses that verify the age of the water that the stories said was ancient. The invitation is to a different kind of knowing, not instead of Western science, alongside it, in dialogue with it. In the genuine conversation between the oldest and the newest major knowledge traditions that human civilization has produced, conducted in one of the oldest and most extraordinary landscapes on Earth, the Kimberley is waiting for us to accept that invitation, as it has been waiting, patient as the rock, for a very long time. The boreholes go down, the truth comes up, the elders speak, the instruments confirm, and the conversation continues, deepening, widening, drawing more people in, as the understanding of what the Kimberley holds and what the people who have held it for 50,000 years know about it spreads into the world. The warning was right. The knowledge is real. The country remembers. And now, finally, so do we. The knowledge of what lies beneath the Kimberley is one of the most extraordinary things in the world. It is 50,000 years old. It is alive. It is held by people who have dedicated their lives and their communities to maintaining it across every disruption that the world has thrown at them. And it is true. Every borehole confirms it, every survey confirms it, every field season adds another chapter to the growing scientific record of the things that the elders knew and the instruments are now confirming. This is the story of the Kimberley underground, the longest story, the deepest truth, the most patient vindication, still being told by the elders, by the country, by the instruments that are finally, after all the long patience, beginning to hear what the country has always been saying. The boreholes go down, the truth comes up, the warning was right, and the knowledge endures, as it always has, as it always will, in the deep, ancient, extraordinary underground of the world's oldest country, still known, still true, still waiting for us to listen as the elders have always listened for 50,000 years and counting. If you have come this far in the story, you have traveled a long distance with the knowledge of the Kimberley. You have gone beneath the surface of one of the oldest landscapes on Earth into the underground world that the Aboriginal Elders have been describing for 50,000 years, and you have seen through the instruments and the boreholes and the surveys and the isotope analyses and the cave biologies, what was always there, what was always known, what the country has always been holding in its deep and ancient underground. You have heard something of what the elders know, not all of it, not the parts that belong only to the specific custodians of specific country, not the ceremonial knowledge that is transmitted in the appropriate contexts to the appropriate people, but enough to understand that the knowledge is real, that the warnings were right, that what lies beneath the Kimberley is what the elders have always said was there, and that the confirmation of this borehole by borehole and survey by survey and field season by field season is one of the most extraordinary things happening in Australian science right now. The story of the Kimberley Underground is also a story about Australia itself, about what kind of country Australia wants to be in its relationship with its Indigenous peoples and with the knowledge those peoples hold, about whether the recognition of native title and the acknowledgement of traditional ownership will translate into the kinds of genuine partnership and genuine incorporation of traditional knowledge into decision-making that the evidence demands, about whether the extraordinary knowledge that the Aboriginal custodians of the Kimberley have maintained through so much hardship will be honoured and engaged with in ways that do justice to what it represents and what it has cost. These are questions that Australia is still working out the answers to, The process is slow and uneven and often frustrating to the people who know most clearly what is at stake. But the direction of travel, in the scientific community at least, is increasingly clear. The knowledge matters. The custodians matter. The 50,000-year tradition of knowing this country matters. And the obligation to engage with that knowledge seriously, rigorously, and with genuine respect for the people who hold it is becoming more widely accepted. The Kimberley will be here for a very long time. The rock is among the oldest on Earth, and it will outlast everything that the contemporary world can throw at it. The water in the deep aquifers will keep moving through the fractures in the rock, carrying its ancient chemical memory, for as long as the hydrological gradients that drive it persist. The caves will keep forming and changing and accumulating their extraordinary biological communities in the dark and the silence of the deep country, as they have for millions of years. And the knowledge of all this, if the communities that hold it are supported in maintaining it, will keep being transmitted, generation to generation, in the living tradition of the dreaming. From the elders who know it now to the young people who are learning it in the appropriate ways and in the appropriate contexts for the appropriate purposes. As it has been transmitted for 50,000 years, the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley is not finished. It is not close to finished. There are depths that the boreholes have not yet reached. There are connections that the surveys have not yet mapped. There are caves that no person with modern recording technology has yet entered. There are biological communities in the deep underground that science has not yet described. There are aspects of the underground system that the traditional knowledge describes and that the scientific understanding has not yet confirmed. All of this is waiting. In the dark and the deep of the most ancient landscape on Earth, being held, as it has always been held, by the country and by the people whose knowledge of the country is the most comprehensive, the most accurate, and the most extraordinary knowledge of any specific landscape that any human tradition has ever produced. The boreholes will keep going down, the truth will keep coming up, and the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley, the longest and deepest and most extraordinary story about any landscape on Earth, will keep being told by the elders, by the scientists who are learning to listen, by the country itself, in the language of its rock and its water and its ancient, patient underground. The warning was right. The knowledge was real. The scientists finally looked, and what they found was what was always there, what the elders always knew, what the country has always held. In the deep and the dark, in the ancient underground of the Kimberley, the oldest country, the deepest knowledge, the longest story, still being told, still true, still here, still waiting for us to understand, still waiting for us to listen, still waiting for us to be worthy of the knowledge that has been offered to us for 50,000 years, by the people who have known this country longer than any people have known any place on Earth, by the Aboriginal Elders of the Kimberley, who warned for 50,000 years about what lies beneath, and who were right, who were always right, who are still here, still knowing, still telling the story of what lies beneath the Kimberley. For all of us, for all of time, there is a particular quality to the silence in the deep gorges of the Kimberley at dusk. It is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of a place that is very, very full. Full of time, of course, because time is what this country holds in extraordinary abundance, but also full of presence. The presence of every generation of people who has stood in these gorges, looked up at these walls, sat by these waterholes, and felt what you feel when you stand here now. That ancient, attended quality, that sense of a country that knows you are here. The elders have words for this. They have always had words for this. It is part of what they know about the Kimberley that cannot be reduced to data about underground water systems or geological connections or cave biology, even though the data is real and important and extraordinary. It is part of what 50,000 years of intimate relationship with a landscape produces that goes beyond any single category of knowledge. The scientific work in the Kimberley is confirming the empirical content of the traditional knowledge. The boreholes and the surveys and the isotope analyses are providing the kind of evidence that the scientific tradition requires in order to recognize something as true. And that evidence is extraordinary and important and should change how we think about this landscape and how we manage it. But the full truth of the Kimberley is larger than what the boreholes can reach. It includes the quality of the silence in the gorges at dusk, the specific character of the morning light on the ancient red rock, the sound of the rivers in the wet season when the water comes down in a volume that shakes the ground, the particular way that this country holds the knowledge of its own past in its surface and its underground, and in the minds of the people who have been paying attention to it for 50,000 years. The warning was right, the knowledge was real, the country remembers, and now, at last, so do we. The boreholes go down, the ancient water rises, the instruments confirm, the elders speak, and the deep, patient, extraordinary knowledge of what lies beneath the Kimberley moves, slowly and with grace, from the underground where it has always lived, into the light of a world that is, finally, beginning to understand what it is hearing. The story is not over, the Kimberley endures, the knowledge endures, and the telling endures, as it always has, across the longest span of human history that any knowledge tradition anywhere on Earth has ever maintained. For 50,000 years and counting, in the oldest country, with the deepest knowledge, still here, still known, still true. The knowledge of what lies beneath the Kimberley belongs to the people who have held it for 50,000 years. It is not a possession to be transferred or a secret to be unlocked by outsiders. It is a relationship, the most ancient and most sustained relationship between a people and a landscape that exists anywhere on Earth. It is offered, in appropriate ways and in appropriate contexts, to those who approach it with genuine respect and genuine curiosity. And what is offered is, in every case, more extraordinary than expected. The boreholes have been going down, the truth has been coming up, the elders have been speaking, the instruments have been confirming, and the story of the Kimberley Underground, the longest and the deepest and the most extraordinary story about any landscape on Earth, continues to unfold. In the dark, in the deep, in the ancient water and the ancient rock, where the knowledge has always been, where it will always be. The warning was right. The knowledge endures. The country remembers. And now, finally, we are learning to remember with it. The Kimberley has always been here. The knowledge has always been held. The elders have always known what lies beneath. And the boreholes confirm it, as they have confirmed it before, and will confirm it again. As long as there are people curious enough to look where the elders point, and humble enough to understand what they find when they do. The ground is deep, the water is ancient, the knowledge is older than anyone can fully comprehend, and the story, the one the elders have told for 50,000 years about what lies beneath, is true.